Hello there. Thank you for being here tonight. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe the day still hangs around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling to a place most ancient peoples feared to name. To the realm that everyone must enter but no one returns from. To the kingdom ruled not by a god, but by a queen. A goddess who sat on a throne in absolute darkness. Who governed not through love or worship, but through inevitability. 4,000 years ago, the Mesopotamians believed that when you died, you descended to her realm. You passed through 7 gates. You stood before her throne, and there you remained, forever, in silence, in stillness, in the land where the raven utters no cry and dust is food and clay is bread. This was not hell. This was not punishment. This was simply what came after, for everyone. Kings and slaves, heroes and cowards, all equal in her domain. Her name was Ereshkigal, the queen of the great below. Where are you listening from tonight? I wonder if you're somewhere quiet, somewhere dark perhaps, somewhere that feels. Ereshkigal is one of the most fascinating figures in ancient mythology. Not because she was worshipped, she barely was. Not because she was loved, she was feared. But because she represented something fundamental, something every human must face. She was death personified, death given form, death seated on a throne in a palace beneath the earth. And unlike many death gods, she was female, was queen, was the ruler who could not be overruled. Not by kings, not by heroes, not even by other gods. When Inanna, goddess of love and war, descended to the underworld and challenged her sister's authority, Ereshkigal killed her, hung her corpse on a hook, left her to rot, because in the realm of death, Ereshkigal's word was absolute, her power was total, her realm was inescapable. But here's the strange thing. Despite governing the one place everyone must go, despite being perhaps the most universally relevant deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon, Ereshkigal had no temples, no priests, no festivals, no worship in any conventional sense. She existed in the texts, in the myths, in the fearful whispers of people who knew they'd meet her eventually, but she remained distant, silent, hidden in her realm beneath the earth, waiting, always waiting, for everyone, for you, for me, for the ancients who told her stories, and for us who still wonder about her. Tonight we'll explore who she was, or who the Mesopotamians believed she was. We'll trace her through the cuneiform tablets, through the burial practices, through the myths that describe her palace, and her power, and her eternal isolation. We'll ask why death needed a queen, why the underworld required governance, why the ancient peoples gave structure and sovereignty to the one thing that seems most chaotic, most terrifying, most beyond human control. If you're inclined, a like or subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this space find others who might need it, but no pressure. You're here now. That's what matters. Now settle in. Feel whatever's around you. Let your breath slow. Picture darkness. Not frightening darkness, just absence of light. The kind of darkness that exists deep underground, where no sun has ever reached, where no star shines, where the only sound is silence, where the only movement is stillness. This is Ereshkigal's realm. This is where the ancient Mesopotamians believed all souls travelled, down, always down, through gates that stripped away identity, through passages that removed power, into the presence of the queen who ruled through simple fact of existence. You died, you descended, you entered her domain, and there you stayed, not tortured, not punished, just there, in the quiet, in the dark, in the eternal rest that Ereshkigal governed with absolute authority. The question we'll explore isn't whether she was real. The ancient Mesopotamians believed she was, believed in her completely, organized their understanding of death around her. The question is, why? Why a queen? Why such absolute power given to a goddess who inspired fear but not devotion? Why create this figure, this silent sovereign, this ruler of the realm everyone must enter, but none can escape? And what does it mean that for thousands of years, across multiple civilizations, across the rise and fall of empires, Ereshkigal endured? Her name changed, her stories evolved, but the essential truth remained. Death has a queen, death has a throne, death has order, and that order, however dark, however silent, however terrifying, is governed, is structured, is ruled by someone who cannot be defied. Take a breath. The journey begins not in the underworld but in the world above, in ancient Mesopotamia, in the cities where people lived and died, in the culture that first gave Ereshkigal her throne, in the time when death was not abstract, not distant, but immediate, present, familiar, when burial grounds sat beside homes, when mortality shaped every aspect of existence, when the question of what happens after death was not philosophical but urgent, practical, necessary. The Mesopotamians needed an answer, needed to know where the dead went, what awaited them, who ruled there, and from that need, from that ancient wondering, Ereshkigal emerged, the queen of silence, the ruler of eternal rest, the goddess who waits still in the stories we tell, in the darkness we fear, in the inevitable end that comes for everyone. Her realm awaits, her throne endures, and tonight we descend, not physically, but through story, through archaeology, through the patient exploration of what the ancients believed about death and the queen who governed it. Long before anyone wrote the name Ereshkigal, long before cuneiform pressed her story into clay, the land between the rivers knew death intimately. This was Mesopotamia, southern Iraq, the delta where the Tigris and Euphrates met the sea, and it was hot, unbearably hot in summer, the kind of heat that kills, that forces everything into shade, that makes survival itself a daily negotiation. The air shimmered above the earth, the sun was relentless, and in that heat, death came quickly. A body left in the sun would decompose within hours, would bloat, would attract flies, would become something that needed to be buried immediately, not for spiritual reasons necessarily, for practical ones, for health, for the living who remained. This was the world that created death gods. Between 4000 and 3000 BCE, as villages became towns and towns became cities, the relationship with death changed, became concentrated. In a village of 50 people, death is occasional, personal, manageable. But in a city of 5,000, death is constant, is visible, is the daily reality that shapes everything. The burial grounds grew, expanded, became necessary infrastructure. The cities of the living were surrounded by cities of the dead. Had vast cemeteries. Uruk too. The graves outnumbered the houses eventually, and walking past them, living beside them, the ancient Mesopotamians developed complex beliefs, complex systems, complex theologies to make sense of what everyone experienced but no one could explain. Perhaps the most striking thing about early Mesopotamian death beliefs is their bleakness, their equality. There was no heaven, no reward for virtue, no punishment for vice, just the underworld. The same destination for everyone. Kings and beggars went to the same dark place, ate the same dust, dwelt in the same silence. This is unusual. Most ancient cultures create hierarchies in the afterlife, create better places for better people, create distinctions that mirror earthly status, but not the early Mesopotamians. Death was the great equalizer, was the realm where all human distinctions dissolved, where power meant nothing, where wealth couldn't help, where everyone, absolutely everyone, ended up in the same eternal darkness beneath the earth. The burial practices reflect this. The graves are simple, positioned beneath house floors sometimes, or in dedicated cemeteries. The bodies are placed in fetal position usually, curled, as if sleeping, as if waiting to be born again perhaps, or as if returning to the womb of earth. The grave goods are modest, pottery, personal items, tools, food offerings, nothing elaborate, nothing suggesting expectation of grand afterlife, just provisions. The practical items you might need, though for what, in that dark silent place no one quite knew. The offerings suggest belief in some form of continued existence, but not vibrant existence, not joyful existence, just existence, continuation, the minimum, the bare fact of being somehow preserved even in death. Perhaps death needed governance because it was so present, so constant, so democratically distributed, when everyone must face it, when it spares no one, when it reduces kings to the same status as slaves. It needs structure, needs rules, needs someone in charge. Otherwise it's chaos, it's terror, it's the void that swallows meaning. But if death has a queen, if the underworld is a kingdom, if there's a throne and a palace and gates and order, then death becomes manageable, becomes comprehensible, becomes something you can understand even if you can't escape it. The psychological need is profound, is universal, is what drives humans to personify death, to give it form, to imagine it as governed rather than random, as structured rather than chaotic. Take a breath here. Let that settle. The landscape itself might have contributed to the imagery. Mesopotamia is flat, is river delta, is land that floods annually, and beneath the surface, beneath the fertile soil, there's darkness. There are layers of clay and silt. There's the accumulated deposit of millennia. When you dig, when you bury, when you place a body in the earth, you're placing it in layers, in stratification. In the visible record of time itself, the earth swallows the dead, takes them down, incorporates them into itself, and perhaps that image, that visible process of descent, contributed to the belief that the dead go down, go beneath, enter the realm under the earth, the realm where light doesn't reach, where the sun never shines, where Ereshkigal would eventually be imagined sitting on her throne, governing the darkness, ruling the depths. The stars that watched these early Mesopotamians develop their death beliefs, those stars still shine, unchanged, the same patterns, the same lights. The ancient astronomers tracked them, used them for calendars, for navigation, for the sense that cosmos had order, had predictability, had patterns that repeated eternally. Perhaps that cosmic order needed a corresponding underworld order. Perhaps the sky's governance required Earth's governance. Perhaps Ereshkigal, when she emerged in the mythology, was the necessary counterpart, the ruler below matching the ruler above, the queen of darkness balancing the kings of light, the sovereignty of death mirroring the sovereignty of gods who govern the visible world. The clay itself was significant. Mesopotamia is clay, is alluvial deposit, is the mud that the rivers bring and leave behind, and clay is what's used for everything, for building, for pottery, for the tablets that preserve writing, for the bricks that construct temples and palaces. But clay is also what the dead become. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return is universal insight. But in Mesopotamia it was clay you are, and to clay you shall return. The texts describe the underworld dead as eating clay, as dwelling in clay, as becoming clay. The substance that builds civilization is also the substance of death, is the material of the underworld, is what remains when flesh decays and bone crumbles and everything human returns to earth. Perhaps this too shaped the theology, made death earthy, made it grounded, made it about descent into the material that everything comes from and returns to. By 3000 BCE, as writing emerged, as cities became kingdoms, as civilization crystallized into the form we recognize, the death beliefs were established, were codified, were ready to be written down, to be preserved in the cuneiform texts that would survive 4 millennia. The stage was set, the cultural context existed, the psychological need was present, the environmental reality provided imagery, the social structure demanded order, even in death. And from all of this, from the heat and the clay and the concentrated mortality and the human need for meaning, Ereshkigal would emerge. Not yet, not quite, but soon. The world was ready for her, ready for a queen who would govern what everyone feared, who would rule what everyone must enter, who would sit on a throne in eternal darkness and make death something other than chaos, something other than void, something governed, something ordered, something that, however terrifying, had structure, had sovereignty, had Ereshkigal. When the Mesopotamians began organizing their understanding of the universe, when they started mapping the cosmos both physically and theologically, they divided it into 3 distinct realms. This wasn't arbitrary, wasn't random, was the natural structure that observation and belief created together. The sky above, obviously divine, obviously the realm of gods. The earth, where humans lived, where cities stood, where life happened. And beneath, the underworld, the place of the dead, the dark realm, the kingdom that would need a ruler. The 3 realms needed 3 sovereignties, 3 powers, 3 authorities governing their respective domains. The sky belonged to the heaven god, the distant supreme deity. The earth belonged to Enlil, the air god, the active administrator of visible reality, and the underworld that would belong to Ereshkigal. But how did she come to rule there? The myths offer different versions, different explanations, different origin stories that don't quite align. Perhaps the most common tradition says she was Inanna's sister, both daughters of major gods, both born to power, both divine from the beginning. But at some point, in the cosmic distribution of authority, Ereshkigal was assigned the underworld, or was taken to it, or was abducted. The myths are unclear. Some suggest she was carried off by the underworld, by the realm itself perhaps, that she didn't choose her throne but was chosen for it, that she became queen not through desire but through necessity, through the cosmic order requiring someone to govern death, and she, for reasons never fully explained, became that someone. Other traditions suggest different origins, suggest she was always underworld deity, was never anything else, was created specifically for that role, was born to darkness, to rule darkness, to be the sovereign of the realm where light doesn't reach. This version makes her less tragic perhaps, less the abducted goddess trapped in unwanted role, more the eternal queen who always was and always will be the ruler of death. The ambiguity matters, shapes how we understand her. Is she prisoner or sovereign, victim or authority? The exile forced into role or the deity who chose it. The texts allow both readings, support both interpretations, and perhaps that's intentional. Perhaps Ereshkigal needs to be both, needs to embody both the horror of death, the unwanted destination, and the order of death, the governed inevitability. Perhaps the most intriguing question is, why a queen? Why was death gendered feminine? Most ancient cultures have death gods, male deities, Hades, Osiris, Yama, but Mesopotamia gave death to a goddess, made the ruler of the underworld female. The reasons are complex, are cultural, are tied to ancient associations between earth fertility and the feminine. The earth receives the dead as the womb receives seed. The earth transforms the dead as the womb transforms the embryo. Death and birth are linked, are cycles, are transformations that the feminine, in ancient thinking, naturally governs. Ereshkigal is earth goddess as much as death goddess, is the ground itself, is the dark womb that receives all who die, is the mother who takes back her children, is the return, the dissolution, the incorporation back into the material that birthed everything. The underworld had many names. Kur was one, the mountain, the foreign land, the place beyond. Irkalla was another, named after Ereshkigal herself perhaps, or she was named after it. The boundary between place and person was fluid. The realm and the ruler were identified, were inseparable. To enter Irkalla was to enter Ereshkigal's domain. To speak of the land of no return was to speak of her kingdom. The names varied, but the essential truth remained. This was the place beneath, the realm of darkness, the destination everyone reached, and it was hers, absolutely, eternally, hers. Take a breath, rest with that sovereignty. The isolation was total. Ereshkigal couldn't leave her realm. This is crucial. This defines her. Unlike other gods who moved freely, who visited Earth, who interacted with humans, Ereshkigal was bound, was confined, was trapped by her own sovereignty. The underworld queen couldn't ascend to the world above, couldn't see sunlight, couldn't participate in the divine assemblies where other gods gathered. Her power was absolute in her realm, but her realm was also her prison. She was jailer and prisoner both. Was the goddess who ruled everything beneath the earth but could rule nothing above it. The isolation was profound, was eternal, was the price of her throne, and perhaps that's why she's angry in the myths, why she's dangerous, why she kills Inanna without hesitation, because she's alone, has been alone, will be alone forever. And her sister, bright Inanna, goddess of love and light and life, descends voluntarily into the darkness, intrudes, reminds Ereshkigal of everything she can never have, never be, never experience. The cosmic division was clean: heaven, earth, underworld, An, Enlil, Ereshkigal. The structure was clear, was organized, was the framework through which Mesopotamians understood reality. But it was also hierarchy. Heaven was highest, most divine, most pure. Earth was middle, mixed, human and divine both, and the underworld was lowest, darkest, most removed from celestial light. Ereshkigal's realm was necessary, was essential, was the foundation that the whole cosmic structure rested upon. But it was also bottom, was the place no one wanted to go, was the realm everyone feared, and she ruled it. Not by choice perhaps, not through desire, but ruled it nonetheless, with absolute authority, with total sovereignty, with the power that comes from governing what everyone must eventually face. The stars that the sky god An governed, those stars still turn, still mark the same patterns, still shine on the earth that Enlil administers, but they don't shine in Ereshkigal's realm, don't reach the underworld, don't penetrate the darkness where she sits on her throne. The cosmic division is visual, is light and dark, is the visible cosmos where stars shine, and the invisible realm where they don't. Ereshkigal rules the unseen, the hidden, the place that exists beneath awareness, beneath light, beneath the world that humans know, and from that hidden throne, from that dark palace, from that realm of eternal shadow, she governs, she waits, she receives everyone who dies, takes them into her domain, keeps them there, forever, in the silence, in the stillness, in the eternal rest that her sovereignty makes possible, makes ordered, makes something other than chaos, something other than void, something that however dark, however lonely, however terrifying, is governed, is ruled, is hers. The division was complete, the cosmos was organized, and Ereshkigal had her throne, had her realm, had her role, the queen of the great below, the ruler of the land of no return, the goddess who would govern death for 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization, who would sit in her palace beneath the earth while empires rose and fell above, while cities flourished and crumbled. while humans lived and died and descended to her realm, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, always the same, always inevitable, always Ereshkigal, waiting, ruling, governing the one thing that never changes, the one constant in all human experience, death, and the queen who makes it bearable by making it ordered, by giving it structure, by sitting on a throne in the darkness and proving that even death, even the end, even the final descent is ruled, is governed, is sovereign. When the first scribes pressed cuneiform into wet clay, when the earliest texts began recording, not just trade and taxes but stories and beliefs, Ereshkigal was already there, already part of the mythological landscape, already the established ruler of the underworld. The texts that mention her span 2,000 years, span multiple languages, Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Assyrian. The name changes slightly, the details shift, but the essential truth remains. Death has a queen, the underworld has a sovereign, and her name, in whatever form, is Ereshkigal. The most important text is the Descent of Inanna, perhaps the most significant piece of Mesopotamian religious literature we possess, dating to around 2000 BCE in its written form, but likely much older in oral tradition. The poem describes how Inanna, queen of heaven, goddess of love and war and fertility, decides to descend to the underworld, to visit her sister Ereshkigal. The motivations are unclear, are debated, are never fully explained, but down she goes, through the 7 gates, stripped of power at each, until she stands naked and powerless before her sister's throne, and Ereshkigal, enraged by the intrusion, kills her, hangs her corpse on a hook, leaves her to rot in the underworld darkness. The story is brutal, is shocking, is the clearest demonstration of Ereshkigal's absolute authority in her realm. The poem gives us Ereshkigal's character, her personality, her emotional reality. She's not just abstract death, not just cosmic principle. She's angry, she's isolated, she's grieving. The text mentions she's mourning her husband when Inanna arrives. She's powerful, but also vulnerable. She's queen, but also prisoner. The poem shows her complexity, shows her as more than just dark goddess, shows her as someone who suffers, who rages, who exercises power, because power is all she has. The characterization is remarkable, is psychologically sophisticated, is the kind of portrait that makes mythology resonate across millennia, because it captures something true, something about power and isolation, about authority and loneliness, about ruling a realm no one wants to visit, and being trapped there forever. Nergal and Ereshkigal is the other major text. Describes how Ereshkigal acquired a consort, a husband, a companion in her dark realm. The story exists in multiple versions, the earliest from around 1500 BCE. The plot varies, but the essential narrative is this. Nergal, a war god, offends Ereshkigal somehow, is forced to descend to the underworld, confronts her, and either through violence or negotiation or mutual attraction ends up staying, becomes king of the underworld alongside her, becomes her husband, her partner, her equal perhaps, or her prisoner. The texts are ambiguous about whether this is love story or assault, whether Ereshkigal gains companion or gets conquered. The ambiguity is troubling, is problematic, is the kind of thing that makes modern readers uncomfortable because it treats violence and desire as interchangeable. But what the text reveals about Ereshkigal is important, reveals her loneliness, her isolation, the fact that even the queen of the underworld needs companionship, needs someone, needs relationship. The story makes her more human, more relatable, more than just abstract death principle. She's a goddess who sits alone on a throne in eternal darkness, who rules a realm where no one visits voluntarily, who is cut off from the other gods, from the light, from life. And when someone, anyone, descends to her realm, the encounter is explosive, is charged, is the meeting of ultimate isolation with the possibility of connection. Whether that connection is healthy, whether it's mutual, whether it's what we'd call loving, those are different questions. But the need is real, the loneliness is real, and Ereshkigal, however powerful, however sovereign, is also alone, has been alone, needs not to be alone. Take a breath here. Feel that isolation. Beyond these major texts, Ereshkigal appears in fragments, in incantations, in spells, in prayers that are really attempts to keep her away, to protect the living from her realm, to delay the inevitable descent. The references are scattered, are brief, are often just her name invoked as authority, as power, as the one who must be acknowledged when speaking of death. The fragmentary nature of the evidence is frustrating. We want more, want clearer picture, want complete mythology. but what we have is enough, is sufficient to understand that Ereshkigal mattered, was central, was the figure ancient Mesopotamians thought of when they thought of death, when they buried their dead, when they feared their own mortality. Her epithets are telling: Queen of the Great Below, Lady of the Great Earth, she who makes the judgment. The titles emphasize sovereignty, emphasize authority, emphasize her role as ruler, not as servant, not as administrator, as queen, as the one who makes decisions, who judges, who determines fates. The language is royal, is political, is the vocabulary used for earthly monarchs. Ereshkigal is not just personification of death, is monarch of death, is the one who governs it, who structures it, who makes it kingdom rather than chaos. Perhaps most striking is what's missing. No texts describe temples to Ereshkigal, no liturgies for her worship, no festivals in her honor, no priesthood dedicated to her service. The silence is profound, is meaningful. Death gods in other cultures had temples, had cults, had organized worship, but not Ereshkigal. She existed in the texts, existed in belief, existed in fear, but not in worship, not in the public religious life that characterized Mesopotamian cities. The absence is the point, is the evidence. Ereshkigal was feared, was acknowledged, was respected, but not worshipped, not honored, not invited into human space, because inviting death is dangerous, is foolish, is asking for what will come anyway, without invitation. The texts preserve her, make her immortal in ways the underworld dead never achieved. The clay tablets outlasted the civilization, outlasted the languages, outlasted the belief system that created them. And on those tablets, Ereshkigal endures. Her name, her stories, her character. The ancient scribes who pressed her name into clay, they couldn't have known their work would survive millennia, would be read by peoples who don't believe in her, who don't fear her, who study her as mythology rather than theology. But they preserved her nonetheless, made her eternal through text, through story, through the patient act of recording what people believed about death and the queen who governed it. The texts speak, and Ereshkigal's name, however ancient, however foreign, however tied to dead civilizations, continues. Echoes, waits in the tablets, waits in the translations, waits in the stories we still tell about the Queen of Darkness, the ruler of eternal rest, the goddess who sits on a throne beneath the earth and governs the one thing that unites all humanity, the one destination we all share, the realm we'll all enter, where Ereshkigal waits, has always waited, will always wait, in the silence, in the darkness, in the eternal stillness of the great below. When archaeologists first excavated the great cemeteries of ancient Mesopotamia, when they carefully brushed away millennia of accumulated earth, what emerged was not just bones and pottery, it was evidence of belief, of careful attention to death, of the conviction that how you buried the dead mattered, that the transition from life to death required ritual, required preparation, required acknowledgement of powers beyond human control. The burials speak, not in words, but in arrangement, in orientation, in the objects placed beside bodies that would never use them, in the care taken to position limbs just so, to face bodies in specific directions, to create in earth what couldn't be created in life: order, peace. The proper entry into Ereshkigal's realm. The royal cemetery at is perhaps the most spectacular example, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, dating to around 2600 BCE. The tombs are elaborate, are rich with grave goods, are shocking in what they reveal about death practices, because some of the royal burials aren't just royal, are mass graves, death pits, where dozens of people, retainers, servants, soldiers, musicians, were buried alongside their rulers. The bodies are arranged carefully, are positioned as if performing duties, as if serving their monarch in death, as they served in life. The evidence suggests they entered the tombs alive, drank poison perhaps, died in formation, were buried with the tools of their trades, with the instruments they played, with the weapons they carried, with everything needed to continue service in the underworld. The discovery was disturbing, still is, raises questions about choice and coercion, about whether these retainers went willingly, believing they'd continue serving in Ereshkigal's realm, or whether they were forced, were sacrificed, were killed to accompany their rulers into death. We may never know. The bones don't reveal motivation, don't show whether the poison was accepted or administered, don't clarify whether this was devotion or murder, but what's clear is belief. Belief that death was not end, that service continued, that Ereshkigal's realm was organized like earthly realm, had monarchs and servants, had hierarchy, had structure that required retainers to function properly. The grave goods are telling. In royal tombs and common graves, both objects are placed with the dead. Pottery, weapons, jewellery, food offerings, personal seals. The items are practical, are the things you'd need in life, for eating, for identifying yourself, for defending, for adorning. The placement suggests expectation, suggests the dead would use these things, would need them in the underworld, would require sustenance and identity and protection. Even in Ereshkigal's realm, the belief wasn't that death was oblivion, was that death was continuation, diminished continuation perhaps, dark continuation, but continuation nonetheless, and continuation requires equipment, requires provisions, requires the careful preparation that grave goods represent. The positioning of bodies is consistent, fetal position usually, curled on the side, knees drawn up, arms bent, the posture of sleep, or of birth, or of return to the womb. The orientation varies by period and location, but often faces specific directions, east sometimes, toward sunrise, toward the direction of rebirth perhaps, or toward the underworld's gates, or toward nothing specific, just the preference of local tradition. The consistency matters more than the specific direction, shows that positioning wasn't random, wasn't casual, was deliberate choice, was part of ritual, was the proper way to place a body for its journey to Ereshkigal's realm. Take a breath. Let that care settle. Cylinder seals provide visual evidence. These small carved stones, pressed into clay to create impressions, sometimes show underworld scenes, show figures descending, show gates and demons, show the iconography of death. The imagery is consistent. The underworld is shown as place with structure, with geography, with beings who guard and judge. The seals are personal objects, are possessions, are buried with their owners, and when they show underworld scenes, they show what the owner believed awaited them. Show Ereshkigal's realm not as void, but as place, as kingdom, as the organized space where the queen sits on her throne and the dead take their places in eternal order. Perhaps most striking is the evidence of ancestor worship, or at least ancestor maintenance. The Kispum ritual, known from texts, involved regular offerings to the dead, food, water, libations poured into graves or into special vessels. The practice suggests ongoing relationship, suggests the dead aren't gone completely, aren't severed from the living, are still present somehow, still aware, still needing sustenance. The offerings aren't to Ereshkigal directly, are to the dead themselves, but they acknowledge her realm, acknowledge that the dead exists somewhere, in some state, under some governance, and that governance, that realm, that's Ereshkigal's domain. The archaeological evidence doesn't prove Ereshkigal was real, doesn't verify the myths, doesn't confirm the theology, but it proves the beliefs were real, proves people organized death around these concepts, proves they invested enormous resources, time, care, labor, in preparing bodies for the underworld, in ensuring proper transition, in acknowledging the queen who ruled where everyone must go. The burial practices are expensive, are elaborate, are the kind of thing you don't do unless you believe it matters, unless you believe Ereshkigal is waiting, unless you believe the journey to her realm requires preparation, requires respect, requires the careful attention that burials across Mesopotamia demonstrate. The dead were positioned, were provisioned, were sent to Ereshkigal's realm with everything ancient peoples thought they'd need. The evidence is material, is tangible, is the physical residue of belief in the Queen of Darkness who ruled eternal rest. When ancient Mesopotamians imagined the underworld, when they described Ereshkigal's realm in texts and art, they gave it geography, gave it structure, gave it the kind of spatial organization that makes abstract death concrete, mappable, comprehensible. The underworld wasn't void, wasn't nothingness, was place, had features, had landmarks, had the 7 gates that every soul must pass, had rivers perhaps, had regions, had the palace where Ereshkigal sat on her throne. The geography was theological, was symbolic, but was also literal in the minds of believers, was the actual structure of the realm everyone would enter. The map of death itself, the 7 gates are central, appear in multiple texts, most famously in the Descent of Inanna. Each gate strips something away, removes power, removes identity, removes the markers that distinguish one person from another. Inanna enters the first gate, wearing crown and royal garments, symbols of her divinity and authority. At each subsequent gate, the gatekeeper Neti demands she remove something. Crown at the first gate, jewelry at the second, royal robes at the third. By the 7th gate, she's naked, powerless, stripped of everything that made her Queen of Heaven. She stands before Ereshkigal as nothing, as just another soul entering the underworld. The gates are transformation, are the mechanism through which identity dissolves, through which everyone, regardless of earthly status, becomes equal in death. Perhaps the gates represent psychological stages, the stripping away of ego, of accomplishment, of the stories we tell about ourselves. Each gate removes another layer, another illusion, another claim to specialness, until all that remains is bare existence, pure being without attributes, without distinctions. The interpretation is modern perhaps, is psychological rather than theological, but captures something the ancient imagery suggests. That death is dissolution, is the removal of everything we think makes us who we are, until we're reduced to essence, to the irreducible fact of having existed, of being soul, or shade, or ghost, entering Ereshkigal's realm with nothing, owning nothing, being nothing except another subject of the Queen of Darkness. The rivers of the Underworld are mentioned but not detailed. Some texts suggest water, suggest the Underworld has its own Tigris and Euphrates perhaps, mirror images of earthly rivers, or single river that must be crossed. The imagery is familiar, appears in many cultures, the river of death, the boundary water, the crossing that can't be reversed. In Mesopotamian context, the rivers might parallel the earthly rivers that define the region, might suggest the Underworld is inverted copy of the world above, same structure, same geography, but dark, lifeless, the mirror that shows what the world becomes when life drains away, when Ereshkigal's sovereignty replaces earthly sovereignty, when the Queen of Darkness rules what the gods of light created. Ereshkigal's palace is described in the texts, is the center of her realm, the seat of her power, the throne room where she sits in absolute authority. The descriptions are fragmentary, are incomplete, but suggest grandeur, suggest dark magnificence, suggest the kind of royal architecture that earthly kings built but rendered in underworld terms, stone instead of light, silence instead of music, stillness instead of movement. The palace is where judgment happens, where the Anunnaki, the divine judges, sit in assembly under Ereshkigal's authority, where decisions are made about the dead, though what decisions remain unclear, since everyone goes to same place, since there's no reward or punishment, since all the dead share the same fate. Perhaps the judgment is just acknowledgement, just the formal recognition that this soul has died, has entered Ereshkigal's realm, belongs here now, forever. Take a breath here. Rest with that finality. The Anunnaki judges are interesting, are major gods in some contexts, are the divine assembly, are the decision-makers who determine fates, but in the underworld, they're Ereshkigal's subordinates, are under her authority, serve her purposes, judge under her sovereignty. The texts don't clarify what they judge, don't explain what criteria they use, don't describe what outcomes are possible, but their presence matters, makes the underworld official, makes death bureaucratic, makes Ereshkigal's realm a proper kingdom, with administrative functions and divine oversight and the structures that governance requires. The underworld isn't chaos, isn't disorder, is organized, is administered, is ruled through systems and hierarchies that mirror earthly kingdoms, because that's how ancient Mesopotamians understood power, as organizational, as structural, as requiring judges and officials and the mechanisms that make authority functional. The demons are gatekeepers and enforcers. Namtar is Ereshkigal's vizier, her primary servant, her executor. He carries out her will, delivers death, brings souls to the underworld. He's the mechanism through which her sovereignty operates in the world above. When someone dies, Namtar is involved, is the divine agent, is the one who enacts Ereshkigal's authority. Neti is the chief gatekeeper, the one who questions those who enter, who demands the removal of power at each gate, who ensures no one enters Ereshkigal's realm improperly, who maintains the boundary, the order, the proper procedure. The Gala demons are numerous, are terrifying, are described as pitiless, as unstoppable, as the forces that drag souls to the underworld when necessary, when someone must die but resists, when substitutes must be found, when Ereshkigal's will requires enforcement. The geography creates comprehension, makes death knowable, makes the unknown mappable. The seven gates give structure, the palace gives center, the judges give process, the demons give mechanism, and Ereshkigal, sitting on her throne, gives it all sovereignty, gives it authority, gives it the governance that transforms terror into order, that makes death not void but place, not chaos but kingdom, not nothing but something, dark something, silent something, eternal something, but something nonetheless. The geography might be metaphor, might be symbolic representation of internal processes, of psychological transformation, of spiritual transition, but to believers, it was real, was the actual structure of the underworld, was the map of Ereshkigal's realm, was where everyone would go, where you would go, where the 7 gates would strip you bare, where Ereshkigal would see you, would acknowledge you, would add you to the countless dead who fill her kingdom, who eat dust and clay, who dwell in darkness, who remain forever in the Queen's domain. The geography makes it real, makes it specific, makes it the place that awaits, not someday, but certainly, inevitably. When death comes, and the journey begins, and the descent to Ereshkigal's realm becomes personal, becomes your story, becomes the path you walk toward the throne where she waits, where she's always waited, where she'll always wait, in her palace, in her realm, in the underworld geography that texts describe and believers imagined, and everyone must eventually discover for themselves. Let me tell you about a moment, about a day in 1927, about an archaeologist named Henry Frankfurt, working at Tel Asmar in Iraq, about what happens when ancient belief becomes visible, when mythology transforms into artifact, when the underworld, Ereshkigal's realm, the kingdom of the dead described in texts, suddenly appears carved into stone, suddenly becomes something you can hold, can photograph, can prove existed, not just in imagination but in the material culture of people who believed, who created visual representations of what awaited them after death. Frankfurt was excavating a temple complex, had been working for weeks in the Iraqi heat, uncovering walls, recording pottery, documenting the usual layers of occupation that ancient tales preserve. The work was methodical, was slow, was the patient accumulation of context that archaeology requires. Each day brought small discoveries, pottery sherds, broken bricks, the fragmentary evidence that must be assembled into understanding. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would make headlines, just the careful work of revealing what ancient peoples built, how they lived, what they believed. On this particular day, in a layer dating to approximately 2400 BCE, in what appeared to be a temple storage area, Frankfurt's team found a cylinder seal, small object, perhaps 3 centimeters long, 1 centimeter in diameter, made of black stone, hematite probably, dense, heavy for its size. The seal was intact, was complete, was in remarkable condition considering it had been buried for over 4,000 years. The stone was smooth, was polished, showed the wear of use, of being carried, of being pressed into clay countless times by whoever owned it, by whoever used it to mark documents and goods and property with their unique impression. Frankfurt cleaned it carefully. The stone was cool to the touch, was almost black in the shadow, but in sunlight, in direct light, it showed depth, showed the dark red undertones that hematite displays. The carving was visible, was detailed, was the careful work of a skilled artisan who had spent hours creating this tiny masterpiece. But what was carved, what the seal depicted, that's what made Frankfurt pause, made him call his colleagues, made him realize he was holding something significant, something rare, something that would change understanding. The seal showed a scene, showed figures, showed what could only be underworld imagery. At the center, a seated figure, wearing a horned crown, the symbol of divinity. Sitting on a throne, large, dominant, clearly the central authority. Before the throne, smaller figures, approaching, supplicating perhaps, or just entering, just arriving. The composition was clear, was hierarchical, showed power relationship, showed the smaller figures as subordinate to the enthroned deity. Around the scene, symbols, stars, gates perhaps, architectural elements suggesting place, suggesting structure, suggesting this wasn't random encounter, but organized space, palace, throne room, the seat of power. Take a breath. Feel that discovery. The question was, who was the enthroned figure? The horned crown indicated divinity, but which deity? The seal gave no names, no identifying text, just the image, just the careful carving that showed someone believed powerful enough to sit in judgment, someone approached with proper respect, someone who ruled absolutely in this carved space. Frankfurt consulted the texts, consulted the myths, consulted the descriptions of the underworld and its governance, and the correlation was clear, was unmistakable. This was Ereshkigal, or at least this was how ancient Mesopotamians imagined her, seated on her throne, receiving the dead, ruling her realm with the authority the horned crown proclaimed. The seal was photographed, was drawn, was pressed into clay to create impressions that revealed the full detail of the carving. In impression, the scene became clearer. The smaller figures showed more detail, showed they were souls perhaps, or demons, or divine beings attending the throne. The architectural elements suggested the 7 gates, suggested the palace, suggested the geography that text described. The correlation between text and image was remarkable, was the kind of archaeological discovery that makes mythology tangible, that proves people didn't just tell stories about Ereshkigal, didn't just describe her realm in abstract terms, but created visual representations, made images, carved them into stone with such care that 4,000 years later they'd still speak, still show, still preserve what believers imagined when they thought about death and the queen who ruled it. But the seal raised questions too, raised uncertainties, because identifying the figure as Ereshkigal wasn't certain, wasn't proven. The horned crown was generic divine symbol, could indicate any major deity. The throne was standard royal iconography, could represent any authority figure. Without text, without name inscription, the identification was inference, was correlation, was the best interpretation of available evidence, but not absolute proof. Some scholars agreed, said yes, this is Ereshkigal, this is the rare visual representation of the Queen of Darkness. Others were cautious, said maybe, said possibly, said the imagery fits but we can't be certain, said the underworld might be depicted, but the specific identity of the enthroned figure remains ambiguous. The ambiguity matters, is honest, is the acknowledgement that archaeology rarely provides absolute certainty, provides evidence that must be interpreted, must be contextualized, must be correlated with texts and traditions and the accumulated understanding of ancient beliefs. The seal might show Ereshkigal, probably shows her, shows what ancient Mesopotamians believed her realm looked like, what her throne room contained, what awaited those who died, but might show something else, might show different deity, different scene, different meaning we haven't understood correctly. The possibility remains, the uncertainty endures, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the Queen of Darkness should remain partly hidden, partly mysterious, partly beyond absolute verification. Frankfurt published the seal, described it in his excavation report, included photographs and drawings, made it available to scholars, made it part of the archaeological record. The seal entered museums, was catalogued, was added to collections of Mesopotamian cylinder seals where it remains today, still showing the enthroned figure, still preserving the 4,000-year-old image of power and death and sovereignty, still raising questions about what ancient peoples saw when they imagined the underworld, when they thought about Ereshkigal, when they carved their beliefs into stones small enough to carry, portable enough to use daily, precious enough to bury with the dead. The discovery changed nothing and everything, changed nothing about what text said, about what myths described, about the basic understanding of Mesopotamian death beliefs, but changed everything about how that understanding felt, about how real it became, about the tangibility of ancient imagination. The seal proved that Ereshkigal, whether real or imagined, mattered enough to carve, mattered enough to depict, mattered enough to create visual representations that would outlast empires, that would survive in stone when clay tablets crumbled and oral traditions faded, and the civilization that created them vanished. The Queen of Darkness endures, in texts, in archaeology, in the cylinder seals that show her throne, her realm, her authority. The seals were personal objects, were possessions, were items carried and used, and eventually buried, and when they showed underworld scenes, when they depicted Ereshkigal's realm, they showed what individuals believed, what they expected, what they prepared for. The journey to the seven gates, the audience before the throne, the entry into Ereshkigal's eternal kingdom, where she waits, has always waited, will always wait, in the darkness, on the throne, carved into stone by believers who knew they'd meet her, who knew everyone meets her, who knew that death, however distant, however delayed, is governed, is ruled, is the realm of the Queen, and the seal, cool stone pressed 4 millennia ago, preserves that belief, makes it visible, makes it holdable, makes it the artifact that bridges ancient death and modern wandering, that connects Ereshkigal's mythology to Ereshkigal's archaeology, that proves she lived, if not in reality, then in the devoted, careful attention of people who carved her image into stone because they believed she mattered, believed she ruled, believed she waited, and perhaps, in a sense, she does, wait still, in the seals, in the seals, in the silent stone testimony to the Queen of Darkness who governed eternal rest. When someone died in ancient Mesopotamia, when the breath stopped, and the body stilled, and the transition from life to death became irreversible, the living knew exactly what to do. The procedures were established, were ancient, were passed down through generations with the kind of certainty that ritual provides. Death was not rare, was not unexpected. In cities where disease and heat and childbirth and violence created constant mortality, death was familiar. Was the neighbor carried from his house? Was the child who didn't wake? Was the grandmother who stopped breathing in the night? Was the daily reality that shaped how people understood existence? And from that familiarity, from that intimate knowledge of mortality, came elaborate practices, came the careful attention to transition, came the rituals that acknowledged Ereshkigal's sovereignty, that prepared the dead for their journey to her realm. The body had to be washed. This was immediate, was urgent. In the heat, decomposition began quickly. The smell would come, the bloating, the visible signs of decay that made delay impossible. So within hours, preferably within the day, the family washed the body, used water, used care. The washing was practical, but also ritual, was cleansing, was preparation, was making the body proper for its journey, for its presentation before Ereshkigal's throne. The water was poured gently, the skin was cleaned, the hair was arranged, the body was treated with respect, with the tenderness that love creates, even when love must address death. The washing was intimate, was the final service, was the last act of care the living could provide. After washing came wrapping. The body was clothed or wrapped in textiles, simple shrouds usually, nothing elaborate for common people. The wrapping contained, protected, created boundary between living and dead, between the body that was and the corpse that is. The process was methodical, was done with attention. Each fold of fabric, each tie, each adjustment, the wrapping transformed, made the body into prepared dead, made it ready for burial, ready for descent, ready for the underworld that awaited. Burial happened quickly, within a day or two usually. The graves were dug, were prepared in the family plot beneath the house floor perhaps, or in the city cemeteries that expanded constantly as populations grew and death accumulated. The grave was whole in earth, was opening in clay, was the portal through which the dead entered Ereshkigal's realm literally, physically, by descending into earth, by being covered by soil, by being incorporated into the ground that was her domain, her body, her realm made tangible. The burial position was specific, fetal usually, curled, facing east perhaps, or whatever direction tradition dictated. The positioning mattered, was not random, was the proper way to place a body for its eternal rest. Grave goods accompanied the dead, pottery for food and drink, personal items, seals, weapons for men, jewellery for women. The objects were selected carefully, were meaningful, were the possessions the deceased valued, or the provisions the dead would need. The logic was practical. If the underworld was place, if existence continued there, then the dead would need things, would need to eat, even if the food was dust, would need to identify themselves, hence the seals, would need the familiar objects that made them who they were in life. The grave goods show belief, show expectation, show that death was transition but not obliteration, that something continued, that Ereshkigal's realm required provisions, required preparation, required the careful attention that grave goods represent. Take a breath here, rest with that care. The mourning was public, was loud, was the expression of grief that social rules demanded. The family wailed, tore clothing perhaps, cut hair in some traditions. The mourning announced death, made it visible, made it communal. Professional mourners were sometimes hired, women whose job was grief, whose skill was lamentation, who knew the traditional songs, the proper expressions, the forms that sorrow should take to be socially acceptable. The mourning served multiple purposes, released emotion, announced loss, but also, perhaps, acknowledged Ereshkigal, acknowledged that another soul had entered her realm, that the Queen of Darkness had claimed another subject, that death's sovereignty had been exercised once again. The wailing was for the dead, but was also about the dead, about their new status, their new location, their entry into the underworld that everyone knew awaited. After burial came the Kispum ritual, the regular offerings to the dead, food placed at graves, water poured, libations offered. The practice continued for generations sometimes. The dead were not forgotten, were not abandoned, were maintained, were fed, were acknowledged as still present somehow, still aware, still part of the family. Even while dwelling in Ereshkigal's realm, the offerings created connection, created ongoing relationship. The living fed the dead, presumably, remained peaceful, remained satisfied, didn't return as angry ghosts, didn't haunt, didn't disturb. The Kispum was maintenance, was the regular attention that kept boundaries intact, kept the dead dead, kept them in Ereshkigal's realm where they belonged, rather than in the world of the living where they didn't. Fear of improper burial was profound. A body left unburied, left exposed, left without the proper rituals, that was catastrophe. That was the creation of a ghost, a giddim, a restless spirit, that couldn't enter Ereshkigal's realm properly, that remained trapped between worlds, between life and death, between earth and underworld. The ghost would wander, would disturb, would bring illness or misfortune, would be desperate for the offerings it couldn't receive. The fear drove the practices, ensured that even enemies were buried, that even strangers were given minimal rights, because leaving bodies unburied was dangerous, was creating problems, was refusing to acknowledge Ereshkigal's sovereignty properly, was failing to send the dead to her realm in ways that maintained order, that kept the boundaries clear, that preserved the distinction between living and dead that civilization required. Daily life in Mesopotamian cities meant daily awareness of death. The cemeteries were visible, were part of the urban landscape. The rituals were common, were frequent, were the background noise of existence. Wailing from a neighbor's house, a funeral procession passing, the kispum offerings placed at graves. Death was not hidden, was not removed from view, was integrated into life in ways that made Ereshkigal's presence constant. Not her physical presence, she remained in her realm, but her authority, her sovereignty, her role as the destination, the inevitability, the queen who waited for everyone, and received everyone, and governed everyone after death came. The daily rituals acknowledged her, honored her, prepared for her, made the transition from life to her realm something orderly, something comprehensible, something that, however frightening, had structure, had process, had the careful attention that humans give to what matters most, to death, to the end, to the entry into Ereshkigal's eternal kingdom. When you imagine Ereshkigal's court, when you picture the underworld's governance, imagine bureaucracy, imagine administration, imagine the kind of organized authority that earthly kingdoms required and that the realm of death, in Mesopotamian thinking, required equally. Ereshkigal was not lone goddess sitting in darkness, was monarch, was head of divine government, was the sovereign who ruled through systems and hierarchies and the mechanisms that make authority functional. Her court was populated, was structured, was the mirror of earthly governance projected onto the eternal realm. And from that court, from that organized power, death was administered. Death was governed. Death was made something other than chaos. Ereshkigal was absolute monarch in her domain. This is crucial. This defines her power. In the world above, the gods competed, negotiated, shared authority, formed councils, made collective decisions. But in the underworld, Ereshkigal's word was final. No god overruled her there. Not even the supreme heaven god could command her in her realm. Not even Enlil, the powerful earth god, could override her decisions. The underworld was hers, absolutely, eternally. The sovereignty was total, was the one place in the cosmos where female authority was unquestioned, where a goddess ruled without male oversight, where power was feminine, singular, absolute. The texts make this clear. Make Ereshkigal's authority unambiguous. She is queen, she decides, she governs, and no one, not gods, not heroes, not kings, can challenge her successfully in her realm. Namtar was her vizier, her primary servant, her executor. His name means fate or destiny. He was death personified, was the mechanism through which Ereshkigal's will operated in the world above. When someone's time came, when death arrived, Namtar was often the agent, was the divine messenger who brought death, who carried souls to the underworld, who executed Ereshkigal's decrees. He had authority, had power delegated from the queen, could act in her name, could enforce her will, but was always her servant, was never independent, was the extension of her sovereignty rather than sovereign himself. The relationship was hierarchical, was the proper order that bureaucracy requires. The queen commands, the vizier executes. The system functions through delegation, but ultimate authority remains singular. Neti was the chief gatekeeper, the one who guards the entrance to Ereshkigal's realm, the one who questions all who enter, who demands justification, who enforces the protocols. When Inanna descended, Neti was the one who questioned her, who reported her arrival to Ereshkigal, who carried out the stripping at each gate under the queen's orders. Neti is bureaucrat, is official, is the one who ensures proper procedure, who maintains the rules, who guards the boundary between life and death with the kind of attention that gatekeeping requires. He is not compassionate, not cruel, just functional, just doing his role, just ensuring that entry into Ereshkigal's realm follows the established protocols, that no one enters improperly, that the order is maintained. The Anunnaki serve as judges. These are major deities, are the divine assembly in other contexts. But in the underworld, they sit under Ereshkigal's authority, judge under her sovereignty, make decisions, though what decisions remain unclear. Some texts suggest they determine the length of life, decide when death should come. But this is problematic, because death comes for everyone eventually, is universal, is not selective in final outcome. Perhaps they judge the manner of death, the timing, the circumstances, or perhaps they simply witness, simply acknowledge, simply make official what Ereshkigal has already determined. The ambiguity is interesting, suggests even believers weren't certain what the Anunnaki actually did, just knew they were present, were part of the court, were the divine officials who made the underworld's governance legitimate, formal, properly constituted according to divine law. Take a breath. Feel that structure. The Gala demons are enforcers, are the underworld police, are described as pitiless, as terrifying, as the ones who drag reluctant souls to Ereshkigal's realm when persuasion fails, when someone must die but resists, when substitutes must be found. The Gala are numerous, are unstoppable once dispatched, have no compassion, no flexibility, no mercy. They execute orders, enforce decisions, bring to the underworld what belongs in the underworld. Their reputation was fearsome, was the stuff of nightmares. In the descent of Inanna, when Inanna is finally released from the underworld, the Gala accompany her, insist someone must take her place, follow her until she designates her husband Dumuzi as substitute. Then they seize him, drag him to Ereshkigal's realm. The Gala are inevitability made manifest, are the force that cannot be resisted, that brings death when death is decreed. Why did Mesopotamians imagine death as bureaucracy? Perhaps because bureaucracy was how they understood governance, how earthly kingdoms functioned, through officials and hierarchies and the systems that organized power. Projecting this onto the underworld made death comprehensible, made Ereshkigal's realm extension of familiar patterns, made the unknown knowable through analogy. If earthly kings needed viziers and gatekeepers and judges and enforcers, then Death's queen would need them too. The structure created comfort, perhaps, created the sense that even in death, even in the darkness, even in the eternal realm, order persisted. Rules applied, governance functioned. You weren't descending into chaos, were descending into kingdom, into organized space, into Ereshkigal's court, where authority was absolute but also structured, predictable, comprehensible, through the frameworks that earthly life provided. The court also creates distance, creates bureaucracy between the living and Ereshkigal herself. You don't deal directly with the queen usually, deal with her officials, her representatives, her delegated authorities. This is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because direct encounter with absolute power is overwhelming, is too much. But terrifying because bureaucracy is impersonal, is inflexible, is the system that cannot be appealed to, that follows rules without exception, that treats everyone equally, which in Death's case means everyone gets the same dark fate. The court makes Ereshkigal remote, makes her sovereign rather than personal, makes her the distant authority whose will is executed by others, who sits on her throne while Namtar and Neti and the Anunnaki and the Gala handle the details, handle the actual work of death, handle the transition of souls from life to underworld, while she, the queen, remains in her palace, on her throne, governing, ruling, maintaining the sovereignty that makes her Ereshkigal, the queen of the great below, the monarch of death, the goddess whose court administered the one thing every human must eventually face, the one transition everyone must eventually make, the one realm everyone must eventually enter, where the bureaucracy waits, where the officials serve, where Ereshkigal rules, eternally, absolutely, in the darkness, in the silence, in the ordered underworld that her court makes possible. Let me tell you about someone. We'll call him Enlil Bani. The name means Enlil has created. Whether anyone actually had this name in ancient Ur around 2400 BCE, we don't know, but it's the kind of name that was common. That would fit. That marks him as someone dedicated to the gods, someone whose parents hoped divine favor would follow him through life. He was a potter, lived in the craftsman's quarter, made vessels for storage and ritual, made the jars that held grain and water and oil, made the cups for libations, made the pottery that daily life required. He was 43 years old, had wife, had 3 children, had the moderate success that skilled craftsmen achieved, had respect in his community, had the kind of life that was ordinary, that was good enough. That was the normal existence most people knew. But Enlil Bani was sick, had been sick for weeks. The fever came and went, the cough was constant, the weakness was increasing. His wife called physicians. They came, did what they could, prescribed herbs, performed rituals, invoked the gods of healing, but the sickness continued, worsened, and one morning, after a night of laboured breathing and pain, that even Poppy couldn't fully ease, Enlil Bani's breath stopped, his chest stilled, his eyes, which had been half open, stopped moving. The transition was quiet, was unremarkable, was the end that came for everyone eventually, came for him at 43, in his own bed, in his own house, surrounded by family who wept because they loved him, and because loss is loss regardless of how expected it might be. The family washed his body. His wife and oldest daughter did this, used water warmed in the morning sun, used cloths soft with age. They were gentle, were crying but also methodical. This had to be done properly. Enlil Bani's hair was cleaned, his face was washed, his hands, calloused from years of working clay, were cleaned carefully. The washing was intimate, was the last service, was the final act of care before he belonged to Ereshkigal, rather than to them. After washing, they wrapped him. Simple linen, nothing elaborate. They couldn't afford elaborate. The wrapping was sufficient, was proper, was what custom required. The body was positioned, was carried to the grave that had been dug beneath the house floor, in the corner, where several family members already rested, where Enlil Bani would join them in the earth. The pottery he had made, a cup and a jar, were placed beside him. His personal seal was pressed into his hand, the seal that marked his work, that identified his possessions. That was him in stone. The grave goods were modest but meaningful, or what he'd need in Ereshkigal's realm, or what the family hoped he'd need, or what tradition said should accompany the dead. The burial was attended by neighbours, by guild members, by the professional mourner the family hired to lead the lamentation. The wailing was loud, was public, was the proper expression of loss, and then the earth was placed, was packed carefully, was smoothed, and Enlil Bani was gone, was in the ground, was beginning the journey to Ereshkigal's realm that texts described, that everyone knew about, that everyone would make eventually. But what happened to Enlil Bani next? The texts give us the structure, the mythology provides the map. His soul, his shade, his essence, whatever remained when the body died, that descended, travelled down, through earth, through the layers that separate living world from underworld. The journey was dark, was silent, was the movement toward Ereshkigal's realm that no one returns from. Eventually, however long the journey took, Enlil Bani arrived at the first gate. Take a breath. Follow that journey. Neti, the gatekeeper, challenged him. Who are you? Why do you come to the land of no return? These were the formal questions, the protocol. Enlil Bani answered, or his shade answered, I am Enlil Bani. I was potter. I lived in I died. The answers were simple, were truthful, were all that was required. Neti opened the gate, but demanded payment. Demanded that Enlil Bani remove something. His grave goods, perhaps. His identity markers. The first gate stripped something away, made him less than he was, made him more shade than person, more soul than individual. The process had begun, the transformation from living to dead, from person with name and craft and family to just another soul entering Ereshkigal's domain. The second gate, the third, the fourth. At each, Neti appeared, questioned, demanded, stripped away more identity, more distinction, more of what made Enlil Bani himself. By the seventh gate, he was nothing, was bare existence, was soul without attributes, without the markers that said this was a potter, a husband, a father, a man who lived in Just existence, consciousness perhaps, the irreducible fact of having been, of continuing somehow, of being here in Ereshkigal's realm, standing before her throne. The throne room was vast, was dark, was illuminated by no sun because no sun reaches here. Ereshkigal sat above. Her horned crown was visible, her authority was palpable. Around her, the Anunnaki sat in judgment, silent, watching, acknowledging this new arrival, this latest soul, this potter from who had died of fever and joined the countless dead who fill the underworld. The judgment was brief, was perfunctory. There was nothing to judge really, nothing to decide. Enlil Bani was dead, was here, would remain here. That was all, that was everything. The judgment was simply acknowledgement, official recognition that he had died, had entered Ereshkigal's realm, belonged here now, forever. Ereshkigal's gaze fell on him. For a moment, just a moment, her eyes, in the darkness, saw him, saw the soul that was once Enlil Bani, saw the latest subject added to her infinite kingdom, and then her gaze moved on. There were always more souls arriving, always more dead entering her realm. She was queen of everyone who died. The acknowledgement was brief, because it had to be, because volume demanded efficiency. because death is constant, and Ereshkigal's throne must accommodate all who enter, must acknowledge all, must receive all, but cannot dwell on any single soul, cannot make each arrival significant, when arrival is universal. When everyone comes, when the dead outnumber the living infinitely, Enlil-Bani was led away, was shown to his place, his eternal place, in the darkness, in the silence, in the realm where dust is food and clay is bread, where nothing changes, where nothing happens, where existence continues but life does not. He joined the others, the countless others, the dead from every city, every era, every status, kings and beggars together, warriors and children, priests and criminals, all equal now, all just souls in Ereshkigal's realm, all dwelling in the eternal stillness that is death. That is the Underworld. That is the kingdom beneath the earth, where the Queen of Darkness rules with absolute sovereignty and absolute indifference, because she must rule all, must receive all, must govern all, and all is too many for any to be special, too many for any to be remembered individually, too many for anything but the impersonal governance that Ereshkigal provides, the order that makes death bearable by making it structured, by making it ruled, by making it the kingdom rather than the void. Back in Enlil-Bani's family mourned, performed the Kispum ritual, placed offerings at his grave, said his name, remembered him, kept him alive in their memory, even while knowing he dwelt in Ereshkigal's realm. The connection persisted, would persist for generations perhaps, until his grandchildren died, until the family line ended or forgot, until memory faded, until Enlil-Bani became just another nameless soul among the countless dead, just another subject of the Queen, just another shade in the eternal darkness. But for now, for a while, he was remembered, was mourned, was loved, and perhaps that mattered. Perhaps even in Ereshkigal's realm, even in the darkness and silence, even in the place where dust is food and nothing changes, perhaps the memory of the living reached down, perhaps the offerings sustained, perhaps the love created connection that even death couldn't sever. Perhaps, we don't know. The texts don't say. The myths are silent on whether the dead remember being remembered, whether they know, whether it matters. Ereshkigal rules, the dead remain, and the living for a time mourn. That much is certain, that much endures, in the archaeological record, in the grave goods, in the burial practices, in the careful attention to death that Mesopotamian civilization maintained for 3,000 years. Enlil-Bani was one soul, one death, one journey to Ereshkigal's realm among millions, among billions perhaps, but his journey was everyone's journey. His fate was everyone's fate. His arrival at the throne was the arrival everyone would make, is the arrival everyone makes still, if the myths are true, if Ereshkigal waits, if death is kingdom rather than ending. The journey continues, has always continued, will always continue, to the throne, to the darkness, to Ereshkigal. When the goddess Inanna decided to descend to the underworld, when she chose to enter her sister Ereshkigal's realm, the decision was extraordinary, unprecedented, dangerous. Inanna was queen of heaven, was goddess of love and war, was powerful, was beloved, was everything Ereshkigal was not, was light to Ereshkigal's darkness, was life to Ereshkigal's death, was the celebrated goddess to Ereshkigal's feared one. And yet, for reasons the texts never fully explain, Inanna descended, left heaven, left earth, journeyed down to the land of no return, down to her sister's realm, down to confront the queen who ruled where no one should willingly go. The myth is the most important narrative we have about Ereshkigal, is the text that gives her character, that shows her not as abstract death principle, but as person, as goddess with emotions, with motivations, with anger and grief, and the capacity for absolute ruthlessness. The Descent of Inanna is masterpiece of Mesopotamian literature, is poem that's been studied for millennia, that still resonates, that still captures something profound about death and power and the encounter between opposites. The story begins with Inanna's decision, with her preparation. She dresses elaborately, takes all her divine powers, all her symbols of authority, all the things that make her queen of heaven. She tells her servant what to do if she doesn't return, gives instructions for her rescue, and then she descends. At the first gate, Neti challenges her. Why has the Queen of Heaven come to the land of no return? The question is rhetorical, is protest, is recognition that Inanna doesn't belong here, that the living goddess shouldn't be entering the realm of the dead. But Inanna insists, demands entry, claims she's come to attend funeral rites for her sister's husband. The excuse is transparent, is obviously pretense, but it follows protocol, provides justification. allows the machinery of the underworld to engage, Neti reports to Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal, hearing her sister has come, responds with rage, with calculated cruelty, with the decision to treat Inanna like any other soul entering the underworld, to strip her, to humble her, to remind her that here, in the darkness, Ereshkigal is sovereign, not Inanna, not the bright goddess of heaven, but Ereshkigal, the queen of the great below. At each gate, Neti strips Inanna of something: crown at the first gate, necklace at the second, breastplate at the third. The process is systematic, is humiliation, is the removal of everything that makes Inanna who she is. By the seventh gate, she's naked, powerless, just another soul standing before Ereshkigal's throne. The stripping is symbolic but also literal, is theological but also visceral, is the demonstration that in death, status doesn't matter, power doesn't help. The goddess of heaven is no different from common potter, is just another subject entering Ereshkigal's realm, just another soul to be judged, to be dealt with, to be kept. The confrontation is brief. Ereshkigal looks at her naked sister and pronounces judgment. Death. Inanna is killed, is hung on a hook, is left to rot. The corpse turns colours, turns green, becomes meat, becomes carrion, becomes the physical manifestation of death in its most unequivocal form. The goddess of life is dead, is hanging in the underworld, is Ereshkigal's prisoner, Ereshkigal's trophy, Ereshkigal's victim. The murder is shocking, is absolute, is the exercise of sovereignty so complete that even divine immortality doesn't protect against it. In Ereshkigal's realm, Ereshkigal's word is final. Even for gods, even for sisters, even for the Queen of Heaven. Take a breath, feel that power. But Inanna prepared, left instructions, left her servant to rescue her if she didn't return. The servant appeals to the great gods, creates rescue mission, sends beings to the underworld to retrieve Inanna's corpse, to sprinkle it with water and food of life, to resurrect her. The rescue succeeds, but with cost, with condition. Someone must take Inanna's place, must remain in the underworld, must provide substitute. Death's mathematics are precise. One soul leaves, one soul must enter. The equation must balance. Ereshkigal's realm doesn't lose subjects, doesn't release souls without replacement. The order must be maintained. The population of the dead must not decrease. What leaves must be replaced. The myth reveals Ereshkigal's character completely, shows her anger, her isolation, her willingness to kill her own sister without hesitation, shows her power, her ruthlessness, her absolute authority in her realm, but also shows her following rules, following the cosmic order. She kills Inanna not arbitrarily, but because Inanna entered her domain, violated the boundary, came to the land of no return, and in doing so, became subject to its laws, became subject to Ereshkigal's sovereignty. The killing is personal, the rage is real, but it's also procedural. Is Ereshkigal enforcing the rules of death, maintaining the boundary, keeping the structure intact? She's angry goddess, but also faithful administrator. Is queen, who feels but also queen who governs, who maintains order even when dealing with family, who exercises power even when power might create divine conflict, who rules absolutely because absolute rule is what her realm requires. What does the myth mean? Scholars debate. Some see agricultural allegory, Inanna descending as winter coming, her resurrection as spring. Some see initiation ritual, death and rebirth as spiritual transformation. Some see power struggle, two goddesses representing different aspects of feminine divinity. Some see psychological truth, the encounter with death as encounter with shadow self. All interpretations have merit, all capture something the myth expresses, but perhaps the most direct reading is simplest. This is story about death, about the fact that everyone, even goddesses, must face death, must enter Ereshkigal's realm, must submit to her authority. Inanna survives because she's God, because she has worshippers who rescue her, because divine immortality allows resurrection, but she still died, still hung in the darkness, still experienced Ereshkigal's absolute power. The myth says, death is inescapable, is sovereign, is the realm where even the greatest must bow, where even the brightest must face darkness, where Ereshkigal rules, always, eternally, without exception. The relationship between the sisters is crucial. They're opposites, light and dark, life and death, heaven and underworld, but they're also family, are connected, are two aspects of cosmic order that require each other. There's no life without death, no light without darkness, no Inanna without Ereshkigal. The myth explores this, explores what happens when opposites meet, when light enters darkness, when life confronts death? The answer is conflict, rage, violence, but also, ultimately, balance. Inanna returns to life, but only by providing substitute. Ereshkigal keeps her realm populated, keeps the dead where they belong, keeps the order intact. The cosmic structure survives the confrontation, survives the intrusion, survives because both goddesses, ultimately, serve the balance, serve the structure, serve the necessity that requires light and darkness both, that requires Inanna in heaven and Ereshkigal in the underworld. That requires life to be celebrated and death to be governed. That requires both sisters, both queens, both aspects of the divine feminine that Mesopotamian theology needed to make sense of existence, of the cycle, of the pattern that brings life and takes it, that creates and destroys, that gives and demands return. The pattern that Ereshkigal governs from her throne in eternal darkness, that she maintained through 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization, that she maintains still in the myths that survive, in the questions the myths raise, in the encounter with death that every human shares with Inanna. That requires us, like her, to descend, to face the darkness, to stand before Ereshkigal's throne, to submit to her sovereignty, to acknowledge that death has a queen, and her name is Ereshkigal, and she waits, in the underworld, on her throne, ruling, always ruling, the realm where everyone goes, where everyone must go, where something hidden waits to be discovered in the next part of our exploration, in the deeper meanings, in the symbols and structures that made Ereshkigal more than just death goddess, that made her essential, that made her the queen of silence, the sovereign of eternal rest. Beneath the surface narrative of death, hidden in the imagery and epithets and mythological patterns, lies another dimension, another layer of meaning. Ereshkigal was not just death goddess, was earth goddess, was the ground itself, was the soil that receives the dead, was the clay that bodies become, was the material reality of death made divine, made feminine, made sovereign. The connection between death and earth is ancient, is universal, is the recognition that all who die return to ground, are buried in earth, are incorporated into the substance from which, in many creation myths, humanity was originally formed. The cycle is complete, earth to earth, dust to dust, clay to clay, and Ereshkigal, in Mesopotamian thought, was that earth, was the ground in its death aspect, was the womb that receives rather than births, was the return rather than the beginning. The symbolism is profound. Earth is feminine in most ancient cultures, is associated with fertility, with growth, with the generative power that produces life. But earth is also grave, is tomb, is the place that swallows the dead. The duality is essential. The same ground that grows grain receives corpses. The same soil that sustains life absorbs death. The earth gives and takes, creates and destroys, is mother and grave both. Ereshkigal represents the death aspect, the taking, the absorption, the transformation of living flesh into dead matter, into clay, into the substance that will eventually, through decomposition and time, become earth again, become part of the ground, become Ereshkigal's body, her realm, her physical manifestation. Perhaps this is why she's queen, why death is gendered feminine. The earth-womb connection is too powerful to ignore, too embedded in human experience to separate. Women give birth, earth gives life. Women's bodies transform, earth transforms bodies. The parallel is obvious, is natural, is the kind of association that ancient peoples would make without questioning, without analyzing, would simply accept as truth, as the way things are. And if earth is feminine, if the generative power is feminine, then the receptive power must also be feminine. The womb that receives the dead as the womb received the embryo, the transformation from living to dead paralleling the transformation from seed to plant, from conception to birth. The cycles are similar, are both transformative, are both mysterious, are both governed, in Mesopotamian thought, by feminine power, by goddesses, by Ereshkigal in death as Inanna, or Ninhursag in life. The symbolism is profound. Earth is feminine in most ancient cultures, is associated with fertility, with growth, with the generative power that produces life. But earth is also grave, is tomb, is the place that swallows the dead. The duality is essential. The same ground that grows grain receives corpses. The same soil that sustains life absorbs death. The earth gives and takes, creates and destroys. Is mother and grave both? Ereshkigal represents the death aspect, the taking, the absorption, the transformation of living flesh into dead matter, into clay, into the substance that will eventually, through decomposition and time, become earth again. The Great Earth title is telling. Ereshkigal is called Lady of the Great Earth, not Lady of Death usually, not Queen of the Dead primarily, but Lady of the Great Earth. The earth is her domain, is her body, is what she rules, and that earth is specifically the earth below, the deep earth, the earth that living feet don't walk on, the earth beneath the surface, beneath the cultivation and construction, beneath the world of sunlight and growth, the earth of depth, of darkness, of the layers that accumulate over eons, that compress into stone, that hold the fossilized remains of everything that ever lived and died and returned to ground. Ereshkigal is geological, is the earth in its vast patient accumulation, in its transformation of organic into mineral, of flesh into clay, of life into the components that earth is made from. Death and fertility are linked, are inseparable in agricultural societies. The crops grow from soil enriched by decomposition, by the return of organic matter, by death feeding life. The cycle is visible, is undeniable, is the daily reality that farmers understand, that shapes religious thinking, that makes death and fertility two aspects of same process, of same power. Ereshkigal and Inanna are sisters in mythology, but are also complementary forces. Inanna is surface, is visible fertility, is the growth that happens in sunlight. Ereshkigal is depth, is hidden transformation, is the decomposition that happens in darkness. Both are necessary, both are aspects of Earth's power, of feminine divine power that governs the cycles of life and death. Take a breath here. Feel that connection. The womb-tomb equation is ancient, is cross-cultural, is the recognition that both are enclosed spaces, dark spaces, transformative spaces. The womb receives, holds, transforms embryo into baby. The tomb receives, holds, transforms corpse into what? Into soul, perhaps, into memory, into clay. The parallel is imperfect but suggestive. Both involve entry into darkness. Both involve passivity. The fetus doesn't choose birth. The dead don't choose death. Both involve emergence, birth into life, death into afterlife. Ereshkigal presides over one transformation as birth goddesses preside over the other. The entrance into her realm is described as descent, as passage, as the movement through gates that strip away but also perhaps prepare, that remove life but create something else, some other state, some other existence that her realm contains. Perhaps the deepest symbolism is return. Ereshkigal represents the return to origin, the going back, the dissolution of individual into collective, into the earth that all humans share, that all the dead become. The underworld is not just place, is process, is the ongoing transformation of distinct persons into undifferentiated dead, into the mass of souls that fill Ereshkigal's realm, that lose identity, that lose specificity, that become earth, become the ground itself, become part of her, part of the great earth that she governs. The return is complete, is total, is the undoing of birth, the reversal of emergence, the going back into the womb, into the earth womb, into Ereshkigal's body, and remaining there forever, in darkness, in silence, in the patient stillness that earth knows, that has always known, that will always know. The hidden dimension isn't supernatural, is natural, is the recognition that Ereshkigal represents something real, something physical, something that happens to every body, the return to earth, the transformation into clay, the decomposition that is visible, that is material, that is the actual fate of corpses, regardless of what happens to souls. Ereshkigal is that process made divine, made sovereign, made the queen who governs what actually happens, what inevitably happens, what earth does to everything that dies within it. The mythology preserves truth, not metaphorical truth only, but literal truth. Ereshkigal is earth, is the ground, is where the dead go because the dead are buried, are placed in her, are absorbed by her, are transformed by her into clay, into dust, into the substance that earth is made from. The Queen of Darkness is Queen of Earth, is the sovereign of the ground itself in its death aspect, in its transformative power, in its patient eternal reception of everything that lives and dies and returns to Ereshkigal, returns to earth, returns to clay, hidden in the myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal, buried in the narrative of how death gained a king, lies troubling story, complex story that reveals as much about Mesopotamian attitudes toward power and gender and marriage as about underworld theology. The myth exists in multiple versions, the earliest from around 1500 BCE. The variations matter, change the meaning, change whether this is love story or assault, whether Ereshkigal gains companion or gets conquered, whether her isolation ends through choice or coercion. The ambiguity is ancient, is built into the sources, is the uncertainty that makes the myth difficult, that makes modern readers uncomfortable, that makes Ereshkigal's story even more complex than it already is. The basic narrative is this. The gods hold feast. Send invitation to Ereshkigal. She cannot attend, cannot leave her realm, so sends representative, Namtar her vizier. The gods rise to honor Namtar, to show respect for Ereshkigal's representative, all except Nergal. War god, plague god, god of violent death, he remains seated, insults Ereshkigal through insulting her messenger. The offense is serious, his breach of divine protocol, his challenge to Ereshkigal's authority. She demands redress, demands Nergal be sent to the Underworld, demands he face her, face judgment, face consequences for his disrespect. Nergal descends, but not humbly, not as supplicant. He comes with demons, with power, with the intention not to submit but to confront. He breaks through the gates, forces entry, storms into Ereshkigal's throne room, and here the versions diverge. In some, he seizes her, drags her from throne, threatens to kill her, forces her to accept him as husband, as co-ruler, as king of the Underworld. The violence is explicit, is conquest, is male god overpowering female goddess, taking her realm, taking her, making himself sovereign through force, through the assertion of masculine power over feminine authority. Ereshkigal submits, has no choice, accepts Nergal as husband, as king, as the one who will share her throne and her realm, and her eternal isolation. Other versions are different, are softer, suggest mutual desire, suggest Nergal and Ereshkigal see each other and connect, fall in love perhaps, or at least into passion. They make love for 6 days. Nergal stays voluntarily, becomes husband through choice rather than conquest. Ereshkigal gains companion through attraction rather than coercion. The story becomes romance, becomes the tale of lonely goddess finally finding someone, finding the masculine counterpart, who can share her realm, who can understand her isolation, who can be king to her queen. The relationship is mutual, is desired, is the solution to Ereshkigal's eternal loneliness. The ending is same, Nergal stays, becomes king, rules alongside Ereshkigal. But the path is different, the meaning is different, the power dynamics are different. Which version is true? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps the myth evolved, changed across centuries and regions, reflected different attitudes, different understandings of marriage, different theologies about how Underworld should be governed. Or perhaps the ambiguity is intentional, is the acknowledgement that marriage, in ancient Mesopotamia, was complicated, was both partnership and conquest, was both mutual arrangement and coercive institution, was whatever interpretation the teller and audience brought to it. The myth accommodates multiple readings, multiple meanings, multiple uncomfortable truths about power and gender and the structures that governed both divine and human relationships. Take a breath. Hold that complexity. What the myth reveals about Ereshkigal is crucial. Reveals her loneliness, her isolation, the fact that even absolute power doesn't compensate for being alone, forever, in darkness, cut off from the other gods, from divine society, from companionship. The isolation is her punishment perhaps, or her curse, or just the consequence of ruling death, of being queen of the realm no one visits voluntarily, no one wants to enter, no one returns from. She's sovereign but solitary, is powerful but lonely, is the goddess who has everything, authority, realm, subjects, except the one thing that makes existence bearable, connection, relationship, someone. The myth acknowledges this, makes her need visible, makes her vulnerability apparent, even while she sits on throne with absolute power in her domain. Nergal as war god is appropriate Underworld king. War brings death. Plague brings death. He's death through violence, where Ereshkigal is death through inevitability. Together they cover the spectrum, cover all the ways death comes. Natural and violent, peaceful and traumatic, expected and sudden. The pairing is theological, is the completion of Underworld sovereignty, is making death's governance comprehensive, is ensuring that all aspects of mortality are represented in the ruling couple. The marriage, however it happens, whatever its nature, serves function, balances the Underworld, adds masculine death to feminine death, adds active taking to passive receiving, adds war's harvest to time's harvest, makes the Underworld complete. But what changes? What doesn't? Ereshkigal remains primary ruler. The texts are clear about this. She's queen first. Nergal is addition, is companion, is co-ruler perhaps, but not replacement, not usurper despite some versions suggesting conquest. The Underworld remains Irkalla, her realm, remains the great below that she governs. Nergal joins her authority, but doesn't supersede it. The feminine sovereignty persists. The Queen of Darkness remains queen, even when king stands beside her throne. This matters. This suggests that even in patriarchal society, even in mythology, that sometimes depicts her conquest, Ereshkigal's essential authority is inviolable, is too fundamental to transfer, too necessary to diminish. She is Death's queen. That doesn't change, cannot change, because death needs feminine sovereignty, needs the earth-womb connection, needs the return to the mother, needs what Ereshkigal represents that Nergal warrior god, plague god, deathbringer, cannot represent. The receptive power, the transformative ground, the eternal rest that earth provides. Perhaps the most troubling aspect is what the myth suggests about marriage, about how companionship is achieved, about whether Ereshkigal's loneliness is resolved through relationship or through subjugation. The ambiguity mirrors reality, mirrors how ancient marriages functioned, how women gained husbands through arrangements that were economic, political, social, but not always consensual, not always desired. The myth might be preserving this, might be acknowledging that even goddesses don't always choose their partners, don't always escape the structures that govern relationships in patriarchal societies. Ereshkigal is powerful, is sovereign, is absolute monarch in her realm, but she's also female, and that, in ancient Mesopotamian context, means she's subject to patterns, to expectations, to the narrative that says women need men, need masculine presence, need to be paired even when they rule alone. The myth might be critique, might be acknowledgement, might be just reflection of cultural assumptions. We can't know, can only note the discomfort, the ambiguity. The fact that Ereshkigal's story, even in this, remains complex, remains unresolved, remains the kind of mythology that raises questions rather than answering them. The hidden dimension here isn't supernatural, is human, is the recognition that Ereshkigal's story, like all mythology, reflects the culture that created it, reflects attitudes about power, about gender, about marriage, about loneliness and need, and whether conquest can be confused with love. The myth is ancient, is product of society very different from ours, but the questions it raises, those remain relevant, remain uncomfortable, remain the aspects of Ereshkigal's story that resist easy interpretation, that demand we hold multiple truths simultaneously, that she's powerful and vulnerable, sovereign and lonely, conqueror and conquered, queen who rules absolutely, and woman who, in some versions, is overpowered by masculine force. The contradictions are part of her, are what make her real, are what make her more than just abstract death principle, are what make her goddess whose story still matters, still disturbs, still invites wondering about power and isolation, and whether anyone, even queens, can rule forever alone in darkness without needing someone, without seeking connection, without the companionship that Nergal provides, however he arrives, however the marriage occurs, however complicated and troubling the myth remains. Hidden in the archaeological absence, buried in what we don't find, lies perhaps the most telling evidence about Ereshkigal's nature. There are no temples, no priesthoods, no cults, no festivals in her honor, no public worship in any conventional sense. The gods of daily life had temples. Inanna had temples in every major city. Enlil had Nippur. Marduk had Babylon. Temples were centers of religious life, were economic engines, were the heart of urban existence. Every god who mattered had temples, had priests, had regular worship that sustained divine human relationship. Every god except Ereshkigal. She existed in texts, existed in belief, existed in the underworld she governed, but not in temples, not in public worship, not in the visible religious infrastructure that characterized Mesopotamian cities. The absence is profound, is meaningful, is the silence that speaks louder than presence. Why no temples? The obvious answer is fear. Worshipping death invites death. Worshipping the Queen of Darkness draws her attention, and her attention is dangerous, is deadly, is the last thing living people want. The gods you worship are gods you want to notice you, to favor you, to respond to your prayers with blessings. But Ereshkigal's notice brings death. Her favor is being claimed for her realm. Her response to prayer is taking you to the underworld. Better not to worship, better not to invoke, better to acknowledge her existence while keeping distance, while maintaining the boundary between living and dead that must not be crossed until absolutely necessary. Perhaps the deeper reason is that Ereshkigal doesn't need temples, doesn't need worship. Everyone comes to her eventually. Everyone enters her realm. Everyone becomes her subject through death, regardless of devotion during life. Temples are for gods who need to be appeased. who need to be reminded to provide rain, to ensure harvest, to grant victory, to heal sickness. Temples maintain relationship, sustain divine favor, create the ongoing exchange of worship for blessing that ancient religions operated on. But Ereshkigal gives no blessings, offers no favors, cannot be appeased or influenced or persuaded. She simply is, simply waits, simply rules the realm everyone must enter. Worship is irrelevant. She doesn't need it, doesn't want it, doesn't respond to it. The relationship is not reciprocal, is not negotiable, is not based on exchange, is based on inevitability, on the fact that death comes regardless of devotion, regardless of worship, regardless of whether you build temples or not. The few references to shrines or altars are telling. They're always apotropaic, always protective, always about keeping death away, about preventing Ereshkigal's attention, about maintaining life in face of mortality's constant threat. The rituals are not worship, are defense, are the magical practices that create boundaries, that protect the living from the dead, that keep underworld demons from emerging, that maintain the separation that civilization requires. The offerings are not gifts to Ereshkigal, are barriers, are the price paid to keep her at distance, to delay the inevitable descent, to maintain life as long as possible before death claims what death must eventually claim. The archaeological silence is complete. No Ereshkigal temples have been found, no cult centers, no priestly quarters dedicated to her service, no temple archives mentioning her worship, no administrative texts about offerings made to her in formal temple contexts. The absence would be strange for any other major deity, would suggest obscurity, would suggest minor status, but for Ereshkigal, the absence confirms her power, confirms her universality, confirms that she's so inevitable, so inescapable, so fundamental, that worship is unnecessary, is beside the point, is the human gesture that makes sense for gods who might help, but makes no sense for goddess who simply takes, who simply receives everyone, who simply rules what cannot be avoided. Take a breath, rest with that silence. Perhaps there's hidden worship, private worship, personal worship, the kind that leaves no archaeological trace, the quiet acknowledgement, the whispered prayer, not for favor, but for what? For peaceful death, perhaps, for gentle transition, for reception in Underworld that isn't painful, isn't traumatic, the prayer for mercy from the merciless queen, for comfort from the goddess of eternal darkness, the prayer that asks not to avoid death, but to face it well, to enter Ereshkigal's realm with dignity, with acceptance, with the peace that comes from knowing everyone makes this journey. Everyone stands before her throne, everyone becomes her subject. The private prayers would be unrecorded, would be the whispers of the dying, the hopes of the bereaved, the acknowledgement in darkness, in silence, in the private moments when mortality becomes personal, becomes immediate, becomes the transition you're making right now. Those prayers existed, must have existed, but left no temples, left no texts, left no evidence except the absence itself. The silence that suggests the prayers were too intimate, too fearful, too personal for public expression. The paradox is stunning. Universal power, minimal worship, everyone goes to her realm. No one builds her temples, everyone acknowledges her sovereignty. No one celebrates her festivals, everyone knows her name. No one invokes it publicly. The pattern is unique, is specific to Death Goddess, is the recognition that some powers are too great for temples, too inevitable for worship, too absolute for the reciprocal relationship that temple cult creates. Ereshkigal exists beyond worship, beyond temples, beyond the visible religious infrastructure, exists in the certainty, in the inevitability, in the absolute fact that everyone dies, everyone descends, everyone enters her realm. Worship changes nothing about that, makes no difference to the outcome. So why worship? Why build temples? Why create the appearance of relationship when the relationship is not negotiable, when it's simply fact, when Ereshkigal's sovereignty operates regardless of human devotion? The silence is its own form of reverence, is the acknowledgement that some powers are beyond human influence, beyond human attempts to negotiate or appease or control through ritual. Death cannot be bargained with, cannot be delayed indefinitely, cannot be avoided through proper worship or correct offerings or devoted priesthood. Death comes, death rules through Ereshkigal, and the silence, the absence of temples, the lack of public worship, that's the honest response. The recognition that Death Goddess requires different acknowledgement, requires the quiet certainty, the private awareness, the unspoken understanding that she waits, that her realm awaits, that the descent awaits. Not today perhaps, not this year, but eventually, inevitably. certainly. And when that time comes, when death arrives, when the journey to the underworld begins, no amount of prior worship will change what happens, will change where you go, will change who rules there. Ereshkigal waits, has always waited, will always wait, in her realm, on her throne, in the silence that is deeper than any temple could express, in the stillness that is more profound than any worship could create, in the absolute sovereignty that requires no human validation, no temples, no priests, no festivals, just the certainty, just the inevitability, just the queen who rules what everyone must eventually face. The silence is complete, is total, is the perfect expression of Ereshkigal's power. The Queen of Darkness needs no temples, because she has everyone, eventually, eternally, in the realm where silence is worship enough, where stillness is the only offering required, where the dead rest under her sovereignty, in darkness that needs no temple, because it is temple, is the eternal sacred space that all humans enter, that Ereshkigal governs, that waits, patient, silent, absolute. The question that echoes through every text, every burial, every artifact related to Ereshkigal is this: was she theology or was she tool? Some scholars believe the answer is clear. Ereshkigal wasn't goddess who actually existed, was cultural construct, was mythology serving social purpose, was the personification of death created to make mortality manageable, to give death structure, to transform the terrifying unknown into comprehensible narrative. The skeptical view doesn't diminish Mesopotamian civilization, doesn't suggest ancient peoples were naive or primitive, suggests the opposite, suggests they were sophisticated, were psychologically aware, were creating systems that addressed fundamental human needs: the need to make sense of death, the need to control anxiety about mortality, the need to maintain social order in face of the one thing that threatens all order, all structure, all human meaning. The argument goes like this: ancient Mesopotamian society needed stability, needed hierarchy, needed acceptance of one's place in social structure, but death threatens that. Death shows that kings die like beggars, that wealth and power mean nothing, that all human distinctions dissolve. This could be destabilizing, could create resentment, could make people question why they should accept subordinate positions if everyone ends up equal in death anyway. The egalitarian underworld, where all the dead share same fate, could be revolutionary concept, could undermine the very hierarchies that make civilization function, unless the egalitarian underworld is governed, is ruled, is shown to have authority structure, just like earthly realm. Then it's not threatening, is reinforcement, is proof that hierarchy is cosmic, is eternal, is the pattern that persists even in death. Ereshkigal serves this function, shows that even in underworld, even in death, there's sovereignty, there's queen, there's authority that must be obeyed. The dead don't escape governance, don't achieve liberation, just enter different kingdom, different hierarchy, different power structure. The message is, submission is universal, is eternal, is what humans do whether alive or dead, whether on earth or in underworld. The mythology reinforces social control, makes acceptance of earthly authority seem natural, inevitable. The pattern that extends beyond life into eternity. If you must obey Ereshkigal in death, why rebel against kings in life? If sovereignty is cosmic principle, why resist the earthly manifestations? That goes in, that finds truth in darkness rather than light, in earth rather than sky, in body rather than spirit, in the material, the grounded, the deeply embodied feminine that modern goddess movements celebrate as alternative to patriarchal spirituality that privileges masculine, light, transcendent, heavenly. Perhaps the mystical truth is about death acceptance, about facing mortality, about the confrontation with finitude that every human must eventually have. Ereshkigal isn't just ancient goddess, is the figure who appears in psyche when death becomes personal, when the abstract becomes immediate, when you must face your own mortality, your own eventual descent, your own entry into the darkness. The psychological work of death acceptance might look like descent to Ereshkigal's realm, might involve stripping away denial, stripping away the stories that make us feel immortal, stripping away ego's conviction that death happens to others but not to self. The 7 gates are psychological barriers, are the resistances, are the things we cling to rather than face death honestly. And Ereshkigal, in this reading, is the inner authority that demands honesty, that strips away comfort, that makes us see mortality clearly, without illusion, without the protective mechanisms that let us pretend death isn't real, isn't coming, isn't inevitable. She is death consciousness, is the part of psyche that knows, that acknowledges, that refuses to deny, that sits on throne in inner darkness and waits for ego to descend, to face, to submit to the truth it's been avoiding. Take a breath, open to this possibility. Archetypal truth, the kind of truth that emerges from human consciousness encountering death, encountering darkness, encountering the transformation that everyone must face. Some researchers believe Ereshkigal is not just ancient construct, is living archetype, is pattern that persists because it captures something essential about human experience of mortality, about the inner journey, about the descent that isn't just physical, isn't just dying, but is the confrontation with shadow, with the hidden aspects of self, with the darkness that exists within every psyche. Ereshkigal might not be goddess in literal sense, but might be psychological reality, might be the figure that emerges when consciousness faces what it's been denying, repressing, hiding in the dark places. The queen of the great below might rule not just mythological underworld, but psychological underworld, the realm within, the depth, the shadow. Carl Jung would recognize Ereshkigal, would see her as anima figure, as shadow feminine, as the repressed aspect of psyche that rules from darkness, that demands acknowledgement, that strips away persona at each gate, that confronts ego with its mortality, its limitations, its ultimate powerlessness. The descent of Inanna is initiation in this reading, is ego's journey into unconscious, into the realm where light of consciousness doesn't reach, where shadow reigns, where transformation happens through death and rebirth, through facing what's been hidden, through submitting to the authority of depth, of darkness, of the feminine power that consciousness represses, but that rules absolutely in the realm below awareness, below control, below the carefully constructed self that must be stripped away to reveal what? Essence, perhaps. Truth, perhaps. The bare fact of being that remains when everything else is removed. The 7 gates are stages, are the progressive stripping of identity, of roles, of the stories we tell about ourselves. Crown is achievement, necklace is beauty, breastplate is strength. Each gate removes something, something we think defines us, something we cling to, something we believe makes us who we are. By the 7th gate, nothing remains, no achievements, no beauty, no strength, no identity, just being, just the consciousness that experiences, that witnesses, that stands naked before Ereshkigal's throne and discovers that death of ego isn't death of self, that something survives the stripping, something essential, something that Ereshkigal sees, acknowledges, judges not morally but existentially. You existed, you descended, you faced the darkness, you survived the stripping. That's all, that's everything. That's the transformation that confronting Ereshkigal creates, not dying physically, but dying to self, to ego, to the illusions that make consciousness comfortable, but also limited, trapped, unable to access the depths where Ereshkigal rules. Modern goddess spirituality has reclaimed Ereshkigal, has seen her as empowered feminine, as the dark goddess who needs no male approval, who rules absolutely in her realm, who represents feminine power that isn't nurturing, isn't gentle, isn't the acceptable feminine that patriarchy prefers, but is sovereign, is absolute, is the feminine that takes, that judges, that strips away, that transforms through darkness rather than light, through descent rather than ascension, through the downward journey that Western spirituality often devalues in favor of upward transcendence. Ereshkigal represents the path that goes down, without the protective mechanisms that let us pretend death isn't real, isn't coming, isn't inevitable. She is death consciousness, is the part of psyche that knows, that acknowledges, that refuses to deny, that sits on throne in inner darkness and waits for ego to descend, to face, to submit to the truth it's been avoiding. Take a breath, open to this possibility. The theology serves the state, serves the rulers, serves the systems that benefit from population that accepts hierarchy as inevitable, as divinely ordained, as the structure of reality itself. Perhaps the most telling evidence is the lack of reward or punishment. The underworld isn't moral realm, isn't place where virtue is rewarded or vice is punished. Everyone goes to same place. Everyone shares same fate. This could suggest justice, could suggest fairness, but could also suggest that moral behavior doesn't matter, that ethics are irrelevant to ultimate outcome, that you should obey earthly laws not because gods care about morality, but because earthly authorities enforce morality. The underworld offers no divine justice, no cosmic karma, no ultimate balancing of accounts, just continuation, existence without distinction. The absence of divine moral judgment places moral authority entirely in human hands. in the hands of kings and priests and the legal systems they administer. Ereshkigal doesn't judge morality, just receives everyone. The moral order is earthly, is human, is what makes obedience to earthly authority essential, because there's no divine authority that will correct earthly injustice, no afterlife that rewards the virtuous poor or punishes the wicked rich, just the same dark fate for everyone, the same dust and clay and eternal stillness. The gender dimension is interesting. Some scholars suggest Ereshkigal's femininity serves specific purpose. Death as feminine is death as natural, as inevitable as birth, as beyond human control, as the processes of female bodies that ancient patriarchal cultures found mysterious, dangerous, powerful in ways that needed to be contained, governed. Ereshkigal contains death's feminine threat by putting it on throne, by making it monarch, by giving it structure that mirrors earthly kingship, by domesticating the wild feminine power of death through marriage, through Nergal's addition, through the patterns that make even absolute feminine power ultimately paired with masculine power. The theology reflects culture, reflects anxieties about feminine authority, reflects the need to show that even death goddess, even queen of Underworld, is ultimately part of structure that includes masculine sovereignty, that balances her power, that ensures she's not alone, not independent, not the sole authority even in realm that's specifically hers. Take a breath. Hold these interpretations. Comparative evidence supports skeptical view. Every culture creates death mythology. Every culture personifies death, gives it form, gives it narrative. The forms vary but the function is constant, making death comprehensible, making it less terrifying, making it something that can be understood, prepared for, incorporated into worldview that makes existence meaningful. Ereshkigal is Mesopotamian version of universal pattern, is their death goddess among many. Greek Hades, Egyptian Osiris, Hindu Yama, Norse Hel. Every culture creates similar figures, not because they're real, not because there actually are death gods waiting in various underworlds, but because human psychology requires them, requires the personification, requires death to have face name, characteristics that make it knowable, that transform abstract terror into concrete entity that can be related to, that can be mythologized, that can be incorporated into stories that give meaning to mortality. Perhaps the strongest argument is the absence of evidence. No temples, no worship, no priesthood. The things that would exist if Ereshkigal were deity requiring human relationship. The absence suggests she was never meant to be worshipped, was never deity in conventional sense, was personification, was cultural construct, serving psychological and social functions, but not requiring the infrastructure that gods who need appeasement require. The mythology was enough. The stories were sufficient. The belief that death was governed, that was what mattered. Not the worship, not the relationship, just the understanding, the framework, the narrative that made death something other than void, something other than chaos, something ruled, something structured, something Ereshkigal. We may never know what ancient Mesopotamians actually believed, whether they thought Ereshkigal was literally real, was actual goddess sitting on actual throne in actual underworld beneath the earth, or whether they understood mythology as metaphor, as symbolic truth, as the stories that make sense of what cannot be explained. The texts don't clarify, don't distinguish between literal and figurative, don't explain what level of reality Ereshkigal occupied in Mesopotamian consciousness. The skeptical view is modern, is our interpretation, is what we see when we analyze their mythology with tools they didn't have, with psychological frameworks, with sociological analysis, with the distance that lets us see patterns they might not have seen, might not have needed to see, because for them, the mythology worked, served its purposes, made death manageable, made society stable, made the underworld governable. Whether Ereshkigal was real or invented, that might have been a relevant question, might not have been question they asked, might not have been distinction that mattered. She was real enough, real in the ways that counted, real in effect, real in the structures and beliefs and practices that organized Mesopotamian death for 3 millennia, real in the enduring power of mythology that we still study, still wonder about, still find meaningful, even when we don't believe, even when we approach her as cultural construct rather than divine reality. Ereshkigal endures, whether real or invented, whether goddess or metaphor, whether actual sovereign of actual underworld or brilliant mythological creation that served profound human needs. She endures, in the silence, in the questions, in the mystery that skepticism illuminates but doesn't quite solve, doesn't quite close, doesn't quite reduce to simple explanation, because human death and human responses to death and human needs in face of mortality Those are too complex for simple answers, too profound for easy dismissal, too essential for comfortable certainty about what was real and what was constructed, and whether the distinction even matters. When mythology shapes reality, when belief creates effects, when Ereshkigal rules whether she exists or not, rules in the mythology, in the cultural memory, in the enduring question about death and governance, and whether the end has a queen, the question remains for others. What if the skeptics miss something? What if Ereshkigal represents more than social control? What if the mythology preserves truth, not historical truth necessarily, but psychological truth, without the protective mechanisms that let us pretend death isn't real, isn't coming, isn't inevitable? She is death consciousness, is the part of psyche that knows, that acknowledges, that refuses to deny, that sits on throne in inner darkness and waits for ego to descend, to face, to submit to the truth it's been avoiding. Take a breath, open to this possibility. Cross-cultural parallels support mystical reading. Death queens appear globally. Hel in Norse mythology, Persephone in Greek, though her story is different, Mictecaccihuatl in Aztec tradition. The pattern is universal, is the feminine death deity who rules Underworld, who governs darkness, who receives the dead. The pattern suggests archetype, suggests something in human consciousness, perhaps especially in patriarchal consciousness, that needs death to be feminine, needs the return to be to dark mother, needs death to be grounded, embodied, earthly, in ways that feminine symbolizes. The pattern repeats because human psychology repeats, because death evokes same responses across cultures, same needs, same attempts to make comprehensible, and the figure that emerges, repeatedly, across cultures with no contact, is feminine sovereign of darkness, is queen of death, is Ereshkigal, in her various names and forms and cultural expressions. Perhaps ancient peoples understood things we're rediscovering, understood that confronting death requires inner work, requires descent, requires facing what's hidden. They encoded this understanding in mythology, in ritual, in the initiatory descents that various mystery religions practiced, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Orphic traditions, the descents to Underworld that appear in hero myths and religious texts. These might not be about literal Underworld, might be about psychological Underworld, about the inner realm where Ereshkigal rules, where shadow waits, with death, with the stripping away of everything that makes ego feel secure, safe, immortal. The ancients might have known that mythology is map pieces guide, is the instructions for inner journey, for psychological descent, for the work of facing death while still alive, of dying to self without physical dying, of confronting Ereshkigal in meditation, in dream, in the dark night of soul, when ego's carefully constructed world falls apart and something deeper emerges, something that knows death, that accepts death, that is comfortable in darkness, that doesn't need light to feel real, that can sit with Ereshkigal, can look at her throne, can acknowledge her sovereignty, without terror, with acceptance, with the peace that comes from knowing death, from facing it, from stripping away the illusions and standing naked in the underworld, and discovering you survive, that something survives, that death isn't obliteration, is transformation, is the return to ground, to depth, to Ereshkigal. We may never know if Ereshkigal is real, may never settle the question of whether she's goddess or archetype, or cultural construct, or psychological pattern, or all of these, or none of these, or something we don't have categories for. The mystery is permanent, is part of her, is the darkness she represents, the unknowing, the realm beyond certainty where ego's need for clear answers must be surrendered, where ambiguity is answer, where not knowing is the truth, where Ereshkigal waits in silence that doesn't explain, doesn't clarify, just is, just holds, just receives everyone who descends, everyone who faces darkness, everyone who strips away the false, everyone who stands before the throne and discovers that death has queen, whether external or internal, whether in mythological underworld or psychological underworld, whether in ancient Mesopotamia or in modern consciousness, whether real or imagined or both or neither. Ereshkigal endures in the mystery, in the questions that don't resolve, in the darkness that illuminates nothing but itself, in the silence that is its own communication, in the stillness that is its own answer. The Queen of the Great Below rules, has always ruled, will always rule. The realm where certainty dissolves, where ego strips, where consciousness faces what it's been avoiding, where death has thrown, where darkness is sovereign, where Ereshkigal waits, patient, eternal, real in all the ways that matter. Real, because the need is real, because the descent is real, because the transformation is real, because death is real. And death, whether we understand it or not, whether we believe in Ereshkigal or not, death requires acknowledgement, requires the queen, something other than terror, something ruled, something that has structure, something that has Ereshkigal, waiting, always waiting, in the mystery, in the darkness, in the silence that is deeper than questions, deeper than answers, deep as death itself. The civilization fell, as all civilizations do. Sumerian cities crumbled, Akkadian empire collapsed, Babylonian power waned, Assyrian might ended, the languages died. Sumerian first, becoming dead liturgical language, preserved in scribal schools, but no longer spoken in markets or homes. Then Akkadian faded, then Babylonian, the cuneiform script that had pressed Ereshkigal's name into clay for 3,000 years, that too was forgotten, was replaced, was abandoned. By the 1st century CE, no one could read the ancient tablets. No one remembered how to decipher the wedge-shaped marks. The texts became mysteries, became decorative marks on incomprehensible artifacts, became silent, and with the silence, Ereshkigal vanished. Her name, her myths, her sovereignty over death, all forgotten, all lost to the great forgetting that claims civilizations when they end, when their languages die, when their stories stop being told. But memory has strange persistence, has ways of surviving that aren't obvious. Ereshkigal's name might have vanished, but death goddesses didn't. The pattern continued, transformed, migrated. The Semitic peoples who inherited Mesopotamian lands, who absorbed Mesopotamian culture, they preserved fragments, distorted fragments perhaps, but fragments nonetheless. The underworld remained. The concept of death realm, of place beneath earth where souls go, that persisted. The sovereignty of death, the idea that death is governed rather than chaotic, that endured. Perhaps in different forms, different names, but the essential pattern, the Queen of Darkness pattern, that survived in the cultural DNA, in the stories that cultures tell about death, in the mythologies that emerged from the same region, the same landscape, the same human need to make death comprehensible. Greek culture absorbed Mesopotamian influences, through trade, through conquest, through the cultural exchange that happens when civilizations neighbor each other. Persephone might owe something to Ereshkigal, might be distant echo, distant transformation. Both are queens of Underworld, both rule death realms, both are feminine sovereigns of darkness. The connection isn't direct, isn't provable, but the pattern is suggestive, is the kind of cultural transmission that happens below the level of conscious borrowing, that happens through shared geography, shared human psychology, shared need to give death feminine face, feminine sovereignty, feminine governance. The goddess of death migrates, transforms, becomes Persephone, becomes Hel, becomes Mike-Tekeshuatl, becomes the local expression of universal pattern, and at the root of that pattern, in its earliest written form, sits Ereshkigal, the first death queen, the original sovereign of the underworld, the goddess who established the archetype. For 2 millennia, Ereshkigal was lost, was completely forgotten. The tells that held her tablets sat silent in the Iraqi landscape. The burial grounds that reflected her authority were unnamed, unmarked. The temples that never existed couldn't be found because they never existed, and the tablets that mentioned her, those were buried, were waiting, were patient. Clay is durable, lasts thousands of years, if conditions are right, and conditions were right. The dry climate preserved, the earth protected, and the tablets waited to be found, waited for someone to dig, to excavate, to bring them back to light, to remember what had been forgotten, to restore Ereshkigal to consciousness after 2,000 years of absence. The rediscovery began in the 19th century, when European archaeologists started excavating Mesopotamia, started opening the tells, started finding the tablets, thousands of tablets, tens of thousands. The archaeological harvest was spectacular, was overwhelming, was the recovery of entire civilizations from Earth, from silence, from the forgetting that had seemed final. The tablets were catalogued, photographed, sent to museums in London, Paris, Berlin, New York. And then the work began. The slow, patient work of decipherment, of learning cuneiform, of understanding Sumerian and Akkadian, of translating texts that no one had read for 2 millennia. The work took decades, required brilliant scholars, required the international cooperation, required the kind of patient dedication that archaeology and philology demand. But gradually, the texts spoke, the myths emerged, the names were recovered. And among those names, Ereshkigal, the queen of the great below, the ruler of the underworld, the death goddess who had ruled Mesopotamian imagination for 3,000 years. She returned, not to temples, not to worship, but to knowledge, to scholarship, to the modern understanding of ancient religion. Take a breath, feel that recovery. Even now, the tablets are being studied, new translations emerge, new interpretations, new understanding of nuances that earlier scholars missed. The work is ongoing, is never finished, is the continuous conversation with ancient texts that makes them living rather than dead artifacts. Ereshkigal's myths are read by students, are taught in universities, are analysed in academic papers, are discussed in books about ancient religion. The goddess who had no temples now has library, has the modern equivalent of worship, which is study, is attention, is the devoted, careful reading that keeps her present, that makes her real in contemporary consciousness, even when contemporary people don't believe in her, don't fear her, don't acknowledge her sovereignty, except as historical curiosity, as fascinating mythology, as the ancient attempt to understand death that we find compelling even when we don't find it true. Still today, new texts are found. Iraqi archaeology continues. International teams excavate. Digital archives make tablets accessible. High-resolution photography reveals details. New technologies allow reading damaged texts. The recovery isn't finished, won't be finished in our lifetimes. There are still tablets unread, still tells unexplored, still sites that might hold new information, new myths, new understanding of Ereshkigal, of how she was understood, how she evolved across millennia, how different cities, different periods, different dynasties imagined the Queen of Darkness. The scholarship builds, accumulates, creates the modern understanding that's richer than any single ancient city had, that combines evidence from multiple sources, multiple periods, multiple cultural contexts, that makes Ereshkigal more fully known now, in some ways, than she was to any individual ancient Mesopotamian. Still today, Ereshkigal appears in modern consciousness in unexpected ways. Modern paganism has discovered her. Goddess spirituality movements invoke her, see her as dark goddess, as sovereign feminine, as the power that patriarchy tried to suppress but couldn't eliminate. The worship that ancient Mesopotamia didn't provide, modern practitioners provide, not as historical reconstruction, not as authentic revival, but as contemporary engagement, as finding an ancient goddess the symbol, the archetype, the sacred feminine that speaks to modern needs. Modern questions, modern spiritual searching. Ereshkigal is adapted, is transformed, is made relevant to concerns she never addressed. But that's how gods survive, how they persist. Not through unchanging worship, but through continuous reinterpretation, through each generation finding in old myths new meanings, new relevance, new truth. The pattern repeats, is repeating now. Ancient civilizations created Ereshkigal. Modern scholars rediscovered her. Contemporary spirituality reimagines her. And each transformation, each reinterpretation, each new understanding is another form of memory. Another way the Queen of Darkness persists. Another proof that death goddesses don't die, don't fade, keep returning, because the need keeps returning, because death keeps happening, because humans keep seeking ways to understand mortality, to give it form, to make it something other than void. And Ereshkigal, whether in authentic ancient form or modern adaptation, serves that need, provides that form, makes death sovereign, makes it governed, makes it the realm where Queen waits on throne in darkness. The stars that watched ancient Mesopotamians bury their dead beneath city floors, those stars still shine, unchanged. The patterns are the same. The cosmos is indifferent to human forgetting and remembering, to the rise and fall of civilizations, to the gods who emerge and vanish, and sometimes, like Ereshkigal, return. The stars don't care, don't notice, just shine, just mark time, just continue their ancient patterns while below, on small planet, humans create gods, and forget gods, and rediscover gods, and reinterpret gods in endless cycle, in the pattern that makes mythology living rather than dead, that makes ancient gods relevant to modern concerns, that makes Ereshkigal, 4,000 years after her myths were first written, still present, still compelling, still the Queen of Darkness who rules the one thing that hasn't changed, that will never change, that connects ancient Mesopotamians to modern scholars, to contemporary spiritual seekers, to you, listening now. Death, the universal, the inevitable, the constant that makes Ereshkigal eternal, regardless of whether anyone believes, regardless of whether anyone worships, regardless of whether her name is known or forgotten or recovered or transformed. Death continues. Death requires governance, or humans require death to be governed, require the structure, the sovereignty, the throne in darkness where someone sits, where Queen rules, where Ereshkigal waits, has always waited, will always wait. Perhaps the deepest legacy is the question itself, the asking whether death has meaning, whether it has structure, whether it's governed or random, whether there's sovereignty in darkness or just void. The ancient Mesopotamians said yes, said death has queen, said the underworld has order, said Ereshkigal rules. Modern skeptics say no, say death is biological process, say mythology is human creation, say Ereshkigal is projection, is cultural construct, is the personification of natural phenomenon that needs no personification, and modern mystics say maybe, say Ereshkigal is psychological truth, is archetypal pattern, is real in ways that matter even if not real in literal sense. 3 views, 3 interpretations, 3 ways of engaging with the same ancient mythology, and perhaps all 3 are legacy, are what Ereshkigal leaves us, not answers, but questions, not certainty, but mystery, not the settled knowledge of what death is, but the ongoing wondering, the continuous asking, the persistent human need to make death meaningful, to give it form, to imagine sovereignty in darkness, to hope that when descent comes, when the journey begins, when death arrives, there's something there, someone there, structure there, order there, Ereshkigal there, waiting, ruling, making death bearable by making it governed, by sitting on throne in eternal darkness and proving that even the end, even the final descent, even the realm where everyone goes and no one returns from, is ruled, is sovereign, is hers. The legacy continues in scholarship, in spirituality, in the wondering about death that you're doing right now. Listening to this, thinking about Ereshkigal, asking whether death has queen, whether darkness has sovereign, whether the pattern that ancient Mesopotamians established, that pattern of giving death feminine form, feminine power, feminine governance, whether that pattern speaks truth, preserves wisdom, offers something we need, even now, even when temples have crumbled, even when languages have died, even when civilizations have ended, even when 2 millennia of forgetting try to erase her completely, Ereshkigal endures, in the tablets, in the scholarship, in the mythology, in the questions, in you. The legacy is alive, is present, is the connection between ancient and modern, between their death and our death, between their wondering and our wondering, between their Ereshkigal and the death consciousness we still seek, still need, still create in various forms because death still comes, still rules, still requires acknowledgement, still needs queen. Whether we call her Ereshkigal or something else, whether we believe in her literally or psychologically or not at all, the pattern persists, the legacy endures, the Queen of Darkness waits, in history, in mythology, in consciousness, in the darkness that we'll all eventually enter, where someone, something, the sovereign of death, the governance of ending, the structure that makes mortality bearable, where that waits, where Ereshkigal waits, always, eternally, in the silence, in the stillness, in the great below, and so we return, back to this moment, back to wherever you are now, listening to this, feeling whatever supports you, back to the present, which is all anyone truly inhabits, living or dead, ancient or modern. The journey through Ereshkigal's realm is complete. The texts have been read, the myths have been explored, the questions have been asked, and here we are, still uncertain, still wondering, still holding the mystery without demanding it resolve. The darkness that Ereshkigal rules, that darkness is still here, not metaphorically, actually. The darkness that exists beneath the earth, that fills the spaces where light doesn't reach. That is the absence, the stillness, the silence that predates humanity and will outlast it. That darkness doesn't know about Ereshkigal, doesn't know it was named, was given sovereignty, was imagined as throne room for death goddess. The darkness just is, just exists, just waits with the patience that only the inanimate possesses, the earth beneath our feet, the ground that will receive all of us eventually. That earth doesn't remember the ancient Mesopotamians who buried their dead in it, doesn't know it was called Ereshkigal's realm, doesn't distinguish between the bones it holds, just receives, just transforms, just continues the work of incorporation, of return, of making dead flesh into clay, into soil, into the substance that everything becomes given enough time and enough stillness and enough patient dark transformation. Perhaps the question of whether Ereshkigal was real misses the point. Perhaps what's real is the need, the human need to give death structure, to make the end something governed rather than chaotic, to imagine sovereignty in darkness, because sovereignty creates comprehension, creates meaning, creates the framework that makes mortality bearable. The ancient Mesopotamians believed completely, organized their understanding of death around Ereshkigal, around her throne, around her absolute authority in the great below, and that belief shaped their lives, shaped how they buried their dead, how they mourned, how they faced their own mortality. The belief was real in its effects, even if Ereshkigal herself was, what? Goddess, archetype, cultural construct. The distinction might not matter as much as we think, might not have mattered to them, might be the modern question that ancient peoples wouldn't have asked, because the boundary between real and imagined was different for them, was more fluid, was less important than the truth that belief creates, than the meaning that mythology provides. The stars that watched the first burial, that shone on the first person to press Ereshkigal's name into clay, those stars still shine. The patterns have barely shifted. 4,000 years is nothing to stars, is the briefest flicker. The constellations that guided ancient astronomers guide us still, the same lights, the same vast distances, the same indifferent cosmos that doesn't notice human concerns, doesn't care about our gods, doesn't acknowledge our deaths, just shines, just exists, just continues whether Ereshkigal rules the underworld or not, whether death has queen or not, whether we believe or doubt or wonder or accept. The stars are constant, are the backdrop against which everything human rises and falls, emerges and vanishes, believes and forgets, and through it all, the stars shine, unchanged, eternal, patient witnesses to everything that passes beneath them. Take a breath. Rest in that continuity. We don't know what death is, don't know with certainty. Science explains the biological process, the cessation of function, the cellular breakdown, the transformation of living tissue into dead matter. But that's mechanics. That's not meaning. And humans need meaning, need to know not just how death happens, but what death means, where it leads, what governs it, whether it's end or transition, whether consciousness persists or dissolves, whether there's thrown in darkness or just silence, just the stillness that Ereshkigal represented but might not rule. The ancient Mesopotamians had their answer, had Ereshkigal, had the mythology that made death comprehensible, made it governed, made it the realm where Queen sits in eternal authority. We have different answers, multiple answers, competing answers, or no answers, just questions, just the wondering that continues, that perhaps will always continue, because death is the one mystery that living humans can never definitively solve, can never experience and report back from, can only face when the time comes, when the descent begins, when whatever waits or doesn't wait, or might wait, is finally encountered. Perhaps Ereshkigal's greatest gift is the permission to wonder, the invitation to face death as mystery, to acknowledge the darkness, to accept that sovereignty might exist there, or might not, but that the imagining of sovereignty, the giving of form to darkness, the crowning of death with queenship, that matters, that serves something human, something essential. The ancient peoples who created her, who told her stories, who imagined her throne, they gave us template, gave us way of engaging with mortality, that's neither denial nor terror, that's structured wondering, that's respectful acknowledgement, that's the recognition that death, however we understand it, requires something from us, requires the facing, the contemplating, the making meaningful. And Ereshkigal, whether real or imagined, provides that, provides the form, provides the face in darkness, provides the sovereignty that makes death something we can think about, can prepare for, can approach with something other than blank horror, with something that looks like acceptance, like peace, like the quiet that comes from knowing that everyone makes this journey, everyone descends, everyone enters the realm, whatever the realm is, where death rules, where Ereshkigal rules, or where silence rules, or where nothing rules, or where something we can't name or understand waits, patient, eternal, inevitable, the silence that fills the underworld, the eternal stillness that Ereshkigal governs. That silence exists here too, exists now, in the gaps between sounds, in the pauses between breaths, in the moments when everything stops and you can hear, what? Nothing. Just the absence, just the quiet that's always present beneath the noise, beneath the motion, beneath the constant activity that living requires. The silence waits, has always waited, will always wait, and perhaps that silence is Ereshkigal's realm, not beneath the earth necessarily, but beneath awareness, beneath the surface of consciousness, the stillness that exists at the core of everything, that death makes permanent, that life interrupts temporarily, the silence that we return to, that everything returns to, The quiet that might be governed or might just be quiet, might have throne or might have nothing, might be sovereign darkness or might be darkness without sovereignty, without meaning, without structure, just stillness, just silence, just the eternal rest that Ereshkigal or biology or the cosmos or nothing provides when life ends and death begins and the transition is complete, and whatever comes next or doesn't come next becomes the eternal state. And here, in the present, the question remains: Ereshkigal waits or doesn't wait? The throne exists or doesn't exist? The underworld is real or is metaphor or is psychological realm or is nothing at all? The mystery is complete, is total, is the darkness that we can name but can't illuminate, can imagine but can't verify, can approach but can't fully enter while still living. The Queen of Darkness keeps her secrets, keeps her silence, keeps her realm, whatever that realm is, wherever that realm is, however that realm functions or doesn't function. The stillness holds everything, holds the questions without answers, holds the belief and the doubt, holds the ancient certainty and the modern uncertainty, holds the mythology and the skepticism, holds the goddess and the archetype and the cultural construct and the unknown, holds all of it, in silence, in darkness, in the patient eternal waiting that is death's essential nature. That is Ereshkigal's essential nature. That is the great below's essential nature, whether literal or metaphorical, whether real or imagined, whether truth or story or both or neither. If this brought you peace, subscribe, share and like for more journeys through deep time, more ancient mysteries, more quiet nights wandering ruins and memory together. The stones are patient. The stories wait. And comment below. From where are you watching from? The night deepens wherever you are. The darkness gathers. The silence grows. And somewhere in that darkness, in that silence, in that stillness, that all things eventually enter, Ereshkigal, or the idea of Ereshkigal, or the need for Ereshkigal, or the space where Ereshkigal might be, waits, in the quiet, in the dark, in the eternal stillness of the great below.